They found her at dawn, half buried in snow, more dead than alive. A mail-order bride discarded like trash by the monster she'd been sold to. But what happened next would shake a Wyoming town to its core. This is the story of Lydia Hartwell, a woman who survived hell twice and found something no one thought possible. A love that asked for nothing and gave everything. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Lydia's story travels. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Lydia Hartwell would remember that detail for the rest of her life, not because Tuesdays held any particular significance, but because it was the last ordinary day she would ever know. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with her name written in careful script across the front. Miss Lydia Hartwell. As if she were someone important, as if she mattered. She'd been hanging laundry in the backyard of her stepfather's house in Nebraska when the postman delivered it. September 1872, and the air already carried the bite of coming winter. Her fingers were raw from the lye soap, her back ached from scrubbing floors since dawn, and there was a bruise forming on her left arm where Silas had grabbed her the night before. Just another Tuesday in the Hartwell house. "Letter for you," the postman had said, tipping his hat with something that might have been pity in his eyes. Everyone in town knew what kind of man Silas Hartwell was. Everyone knew, and no one did a damn thing about it. Lydia had taken the letter with trembling hands, her heart already beginning to race. She received letters so rarely that each one felt like a door opening or closing. She'd torn it open right there in the yard, dirt still under her fingernails, her mother's old dress hanging loose on her frame because Silas begrudged every penny spent on food. The words had swum before her eyes at first, then crystallized into something that stopped her breath entirely. Dear Miss Hartwell, my name is Roy Anderson, and I am a rancher of considerable means in the Wyoming Territory. I am in need of a wife to tend my home and provide companionship. I have been informed by Mr. Silas Hartwell that you are of marriageable age and suitable disposition. I am prepared to pay passage and provide a comfortable home. If you are agreeable, arrangements can be made for your travel within the fortnight. Yours in anticipation, Roy Anderson. She'd read it 3 times, 4 times, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. Silas had sold her, like a horse, like a piece of furniture he no longer wanted cluttering up his house. The laundry forgotten, she'd run inside, the letter crumpled in her fist. She found Silas in his study, whiskey already on his breath though it wasn't yet noon. He'd looked up from his newspaper with those cold, calculating eyes, the same eyes that used to make her mother flinch. "I see you got your letter," he'd said, as casual as if they were discussing the weather. "You can't do this." Her voice had been barely above a whisper. Even after 19 years of his cruelty, she still couldn't quite believe the depths he would sink to. Silas had set down his newspaper with exaggerated patience, the way he always did before he lost his temper. "Can't I? You're eating my food, burning my coal, taking up space in my house. Your mother's been dead 2 years now, girl. You think I'm going to keep you around out of the goodness of my heart? I work, I clean, I cook, You're a mouth to feed and nothing more." He'd stood then, and Lydia had taken an instinctive step backward. This Anderson fellow is willing to pay good money for a wife. Strong back, young enough to bear children, not so pretty that she'll cause trouble. You should be grateful I found someone willing to take you at all. The words had landed like physical blows. Not so pretty, someone willing to take you, as if she were damaged goods being sold at a discount. "I won't go," she'd said, though her voice shook. "You can't make me." Silas had smiled then, and that smile was worse than any fist he'd ever raised. "No? And where exactly will you go, Lydia? You have no money, no family, no prospects. You think anyone in this town will take you in? You think you can make your own way?" He'd leaned closer, whiskey breath hot on her face. "You'll go to Wyoming, and you'll marry Roy Anderson, and you'll be grateful for the opportunity. Or you can stay here and see how long you last with no food, no fire, and no roof over your head. Winter's coming, girl. Make your choice." She'd fled to her room, the tiny attic space that had been hers since her mother married this monster, and collapsed on the narrow bed. Her mother's Bible lay on the small table beside her, worn and water-stained. Lydia had grabbed it, clutching it to her chest as sobs racked her body. Her mother had been so beautiful once. Mary Hartwell, with her gentle smile and soft hands, who used to sing while she worked and told Lydia stories about better days to come. But life had ground her mother down year by year. First her father's death, then the struggle to survive, then the terrible decision to marry Silas Reed, who'd seemed respectable enough at first. The change had been gradual, the sharp words, the casual cruelties, the nights when Lydia heard her mother crying through the thin walls. And finally, 2 winters ago, the fever that took her. Lydia still believed her mother had simply given up, that she'd stopped fighting because fighting hurt too much. "What do I do, Mama?" she'd whispered to the empty room. "What do I do?" The Bible had fallen open in her lap, and her eyes had landed on a verse her mother had underlined. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." But Lydia's spirit felt beyond saving that day. The next 2 weeks had passed in a blur of preparations that felt more like funeral arrangements. Silas had bought her passage west, the cheapest ticket available, of course. He'd given her mother's old trunk, battered and scratched, and told her she could take whatever fit inside. Not that she had much. A few dresses, all worn thin, her mother's locket, the only thing of value she owned. The Bible, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful and doomed. The women of the town had come to call, bringing small gifts and smaller comforts. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had pressed a package of needles and thread into her hands. "Every woman needs to be able to mend," she'd said, her eyes full of things she wouldn't say aloud. Old Mrs. Patterson had given her a jar of honey. "For when times are hard," she'd whispered, "a spoonful of sweetness can make the bitterest medicine go down." They all knew what she was heading into. Mail-order brides were common enough on the frontier, and the stories that came back were mixed. Some women found decent men, built good lives. Others simply disappeared into the vast western territories, never heard from again. Everyone smiled and wished her well, but Lydia could see the pity in their eyes. The night before she was to leave, she'd sat in her tiny room, packing the last of her things. The trunk was pitifully small, her entire life fitting into a space 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. She'd picked up her mother's locket, running her thumb over the worn gold surface. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, her father, handsome and serious, and her mother, young and smiling. Before. "I'm scared, Mama," she'd whispered into the darkness. "I'm so scared." But the dead don't answer, and morning came regardless. Silas had driven her to the train station in the wagon, not speaking a word the entire way. When they'd arrived, he'd hauled her trunk down and thrust an envelope into her hands. "Your ticket, don't lose it. Anderson will be waiting for you in Laramie. Don't embarrass me by causing trouble." She'd wanted to scream at him that she hoped she never saw his face again, that she hoped he died alone and unmourned. Instead, she'd taken the envelope with numb fingers and climbed onto the train without looking back. The journey west had taken 4 days. 4 days of rattling rails and cramped seats, of stopping at small stations where rough men stared too long and spoke too familiar. 4 days of watching the landscape change from the rolling farmland of Nebraska to the wild, empty spaces of Wyoming. 4 days of trying not to think about what waited for her at the end of the line. She'd shared a bench with an older woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who was traveling to visit her daughter in Colorado. Mrs. Kowalski had been kind in that brisk, practical way of frontier women, offering bread and cheese from her basket and not asking too many questions. "First time out west?" she'd asked on the second day, as they passed through a landscape so flat and empty it seemed to go on forever. Lydia had nodded, not trusting her voice. "It's hard country," Mrs. Kowalski had said, looking out the window. "Beautiful, but hard. Takes a certain kind of person to survive out here. You got family waiting?" "A husband," Lydia had managed. "I'm to be married." "Ah, one of them mail-order arrangements." Mrs. Kowalski's voice had been carefully neutral. "Well, that can work out fine. My niece married that way, and she's happy as a clam now. Got 3 children and a nice little homestead. Of course, it don't always work out that way." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Kowalski had been quiet for a long moment. "Just keep your wits about you, child. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And remember, no matter what anyone tells you, you're not property. You're a human being with God-given rights. Don't let anyone make you forget that." The words had settled in Lydia's chest like stones, heavy with warning. On the fourth day, the train had finally pulled into Laramie. Lydia had pressed her face to the window, trying to catch her first glimpse of her new home. What she'd seen had made her heart sink. Laramie was rougher than any place she'd ever known. Unpaved streets thick with mud, buildings that looked hastily constructed and poorly maintained, men everywhere, and women nowhere to be seen. "End of the line," the conductor had called. "Laramie, Wyoming territory." Lydia had gathered her few belongings with shaking hands. The Bible, a small bag with her personal items, her mother's locket around her neck hidden beneath her collar where it couldn't be seen. Everything else was in the trunk, which the porters were already hauling off the train. She'd stepped onto the platform into chaos. Cowboys on horseback rode through the streets, shouting and firing guns in the air. The smell hit her immediately: horse manure, unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and something else, something wild and dangerous that she couldn't name. This was the frontier, raw and untamed, and suddenly Nebraska seemed like paradise lost. "Miss Hartwell?" The voice had come from behind her, rough and loud. She'd turned, her heart hammering, to face her future husband for the first time. Roy Anderson was not what the letter had suggested. He was tall, that much was true, but rail-thin in a way that spoke of too much whiskey and not enough food. His face was weathered and hard, with a nose that had been broken at least once, and small, calculating eyes that reminded her sickeningly of Silas. His clothes were dirty, his boots worn down, and he reeked of alcohol even in the middle of the afternoon. This was a rancher of considerable means. This was the man who would provide her with a comfortable home. "You're prettier than I expected," Roy had said, looking her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Silas said you were plain, but you'll do just fine." He'd reached for her arm, his grip immediately too tight, possessive in a way that set every instinct screaming. "Got your trunk? Good. Wagon's this way. We got a long ride ahead of us." The letter said you were a rancher," Lydia had managed, her voice barely steady. Roy had laughed, a harsh bark of sound. "That's right. Got myself a nice spread about 20 miles from here. You'll see it soon enough. Come on now. I didn't pay good money for you to stand around gawking." Paid good money for you. The words confirmed what she'd already known, but desperately hoped wasn't true. She'd been bought. Purchased. Sold by one man to another like cattle. The wagon ride had been a nightmare. Roy had been drunk. She'd realized that within the first mile, and he'd talked constantly, his words slurring together as he boasted about his ranch, his cattle, his plans. But the more he talked, the less any of it made sense. The numbers didn't add up. The stories contradicted themselves. And slowly, horribly, Lydia had begun to understand the truth. Roy Anderson was a liar. He had no considerable means, no prosperous ranch. He was a small-time operator at best, probably in debt up to his eyeballs, and he'd ordered a mail-order bride for the same reason he'd do anything else, because he wanted something for nothing, and he'd found a way to get it. "You'll earn your keep," he'd said at one point, his hand sliding onto her knee in a way that made her stomach turn. "A man needs a woman to cook and clean and, well, other things. Been too long since I had a woman in my bed, but that'll change tonight, won't it?" Lydia had said nothing, just stared straight ahead and tried not to vomit. The ranch, when they'd finally arrived as the sun was setting, had been worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't a ranch at all, it was a shack. A crude, poorly built structure with holes in the roof and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. There were a few scrawny cattle in a pen that looked ready to collapse, a barn that was missing half its boards, and nothing else for miles in any direction. This was her new home. This was her future. "Welcome to the Anderson spread," Roy had said, laughing at his own joke. "Ain't much now, but it'll grow. With you here to help work the place, we'll make something of it." He'd hauled her trunk off the wagon and dropped it in the dirt, then grabbed her arm again. "Come on inside. I'll show you around. Won't take long. It ain't exactly a mansion." The inside was worse than the outside. One room, with a crude bed in the corner, a stove that looked like it might explode if you tried to use it, and a table with 2 rickety chairs. The floor was dirt, the walls were bare wood with gaps you could see daylight through, and the smell was overwhelming, old sweat, rotten food, and despair. Home, sweet home, Roy had said, and then his hand had been on her again, rougher now. Now, about that wedding night. Wait, Lydia had pulled away, her heart racing. Shouldn't we? Isn't there supposed to be a ceremony, a preacher? Roy had laughed again, that same harsh bark. You really are green, ain't you? This is Wyoming territory, girl. Ain't no preachers for 100 miles, and I ain't waiting that long. Far as I'm concerned, you're my wife the moment you stepped off that train. I paid for you, didn't I? That makes it legal enough. That's not how marriage works. His face had changed then, the false good humor dropping away to reveal something cold and dangerous underneath. You questioning me? After I paid your passage, gave you a home, saved you from whatever shit life you were living back in Nebraska? I just think we should wait until... The slap had come so fast she hadn't seen it coming. One moment she'd been standing, the next she was on the floor, her cheek exploding with pain, her ears ringing. She'd tasted blood in her mouth. Don't you ever tell me what we should or shouldn't do, Roy had said, standing over her. You're my wife now, my property. You'll do what I say, when I say it, or you'll learn what happens to women who don't know their place. He'd reached for her then, and Lydia had scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go in the tiny shack. He'd caught her by the hair, dragging her toward the bed, and she'd fought, God how she'd fought, but he was so much stronger. Please, she'd begged, please don't. Shut up, he'd snarled. Just shut up and take it like a good wife should. What happened next, Lydia would never speak of. Some horrors were too dark to put into words. But when it was finally over, when Roy had rolled off her and started snoring within minutes, she'd lain there in the darkness, bleeding and broken, and wondered if her mother had felt this same crushing despair when she'd married Silas. The locket around her neck pressed against her skin, and she'd clutched it with trembling fingers. Her parents smiled up at her from the tiny photographs, frozen in a moment of hope that seemed impossibly distant now. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted, her mother's underlined verse had said. But where was the Lord now? Where was he when she needed him most? She'd cried silently into the filthy pillow until she had no tears left, and then she'd simply lain there, staring at the holes in the roof where stars shone through, and tried to figure out how she would survive this. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and Lydia learned what survival meant in Roy Anderson's house. It meant waking before dawn to start a fire in the temperamental stove, to cook whatever meager food they had, usually beans and hardtack, occasionally a stringy piece of meat from one of the scrawny cattle. It meant hauling water from a creek a quarter-mile away, the buckets so heavy they left her shoulders aching. It meant mending clothes with thread that was running out, cleaning a house that could never really be clean, and trying to stay out of Roy's way as much as possible. Because Roy was always angry about something. The cattle weren't fattening up fast enough. The fence needed mending, but he didn't have money for lumber. The weather was too hot or too cold or too wet or too dry. And when Roy was angry, he drank. And when he drank, his fists came out. Lydia learned to read the signs. The particular way he'd slam the door when he came in, the heaviness of his footsteps, the tone of his voice when he called her name. She got good at disappearing into herself, at being there but not there, at enduring whatever needed to be endured and then picking herself up afterward. Her mother's locket became her talisman. When things were at their worst, she'd press it against her heart and remember that she'd come from people who'd loved each other, who'd been happy once. It was proof that kindness existed somewhere in the world, even if it felt impossibly far away. The nearest town was Bitter Creek, 20 miles to the south, and Roy went there once a month for supplies. He never took Lydia with him. She was too valuable to risk running away, he said, though where she would run to in this vast emptiness, she had no idea. Instead, she spent those precious days alone trying to make the shack more livable, to create some small corner of comfort in this hell. She'd found wildflowers growing by the creek and brought them back, putting them in a jar on the table. Roy had knocked them over in a drunken rage, grinding the petals into the dirt floor. "What kind of fool woman wastes time on flowers?" he'd shouted. "You want to make this place pretty? Cook a decent meal for once." She'd stopped bringing flowers after that. The other ranchers in the area kept their distance. There were 3 within a day's ride: the Peterson place to the north, the Miller Ranch to the east, and the Collins homestead to the west. Lydia had seen them from a distance occasionally, men on horseback checking their herds. But Roy made it clear she was never to speak to them, never to even acknowledge their existence. "They're all thieves and liars," he'd say, "especially that Collins bastard. Thinks he's better than everyone else just because he's got a nice spread. I'll show him someday. I'll show all of them." But Roy never showed anyone anything. He just drank and raged and took out his frustrations on the one person who couldn't escape. The first snow came in November. Lydia had never experienced a Wyoming winter before, and nothing could have prepared her for it. The cold was savage, brutal, cutting through every layer of clothing, seeping through every crack in the walls. The wind howled across the plains like a living thing, rattling the shack until she was sure it would simply blow away. Roy had laid in supplies. Not enough, never enough, but something. And then he'd essentially hibernated for the winter. He'd sit by the stove drinking rot-gut whiskey, playing solitaire with a deck of cards so worn you could barely make out the pips, and nursing his grievances against the world. The whiskey made him mean, meaner than usual. And as the winter deepened and the isolation pressed in, his violence escalated. It started with words, vicious, cutting insults designed to strip away whatever dignity she had left. He'd call her worthless, stupid, ugly. He'd tell her she was lucky he'd taken her in, that no other man would have wanted her. He'd describe in graphic detail all the ways she failed as a wife, as a woman, as a human being. When words weren't enough, he'd move to casual violence, a shove here, a slap there. "Clumsy bitch," he'd say when he knocked her into the stove. "Why don't you watch where you're going?" But as December turned into January, even that wasn't enough to satisfy whatever darkness lived inside him. The night it all came apart started like so many others. Roy had gone to Bitter Creek earlier in the week and returned with more whiskey and a new pack of cards. He'd been drinking steadily since, and Lydia had learned to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She'd cooked his dinner, watery stew made from the last of their dried beef, and served it without speaking. She'd cleaned up quietly while he sat at the table, shuffling the cards over and over, muttering to himself. But something was different tonight. There was an edge to his anger, a violence simmering just beneath the surface that made her hands shake as she wiped down the table. "My locket," he'd said suddenly. "That gold locket you're always clutching. Let me see it." Lydia's hand had flown to her throat instinctively, covering the locket. "It was my mother's. It's all I have left of her." I said, "Let me see it." "Please, it's not worth anything. It's just—" He'd been on her in an instant, his hand closing around her throat, slamming her against the wall. "When I tell you to do something, you do it. Understand?" She'd nodded frantically, unable to breathe, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. He'd released her, and she'd fallen to her knees, gasping. "Now give it here." With trembling fingers, she'd unclasped the locket and handed it over. Roy had held it up to the lamplight, examining it. "Gold, you said? Looks like it to me. This'll fetch a decent price in town." "No." The word was out before she could stop it. "Please, Roy, it's all I have. It's not worth enough to—" "Shut up." He'd pocketed the locket and returned to his cards. "I'll do what I want with my property, and you're my property too, in case you forgot. You and everything you own." She'd wanted to scream, to fight, to claw his eyes out, but she'd learned in these months that resistance only made things worse. So she'd simply knelt there on the dirt floor, tears streaming down her face, mourning the loss of her last connection to her mother. Roy had ignored her crying, dealing out cards for another game of solitaire. But she could tell he was getting drunker, his movements getting sloppier. After a while, he'd pulled out the locket again, turning it over in his hands. "Your mama, huh? What was she like?" Lydia had looked up, surprised by the question. Roy never asked about her life before. "She was kind, gentle. She loved to sing." "She pretty?" "Yes, very beautiful." Roy had laughed, that harsh, mocking sound. "Then you must take after your daddy, 'cause you sure as hell didn't inherit her looks." The words had stung, but she'd said nothing. "Tell you what," Roy had continued, a strange gleam in his eyes. "Let's make a game of it. I'll play one hand of poker against myself. If I win, I keep the locket, sell it for drinking money. If I lose—" He'd paused, considering. "If I lose, I'll give it back. Fair?" It wasn't fair. Nothing about this was fair, but it was the only chance she'd get. All right. She'd watched, her heart in her throat, as Roy dealt out 5 cards to himself, studied them, discarded 3, drew 3 more. His face had gone from confident to confused to angry in the space of seconds. Son of a bitch, he'd muttered. Worthless hand. He'd thrown the cards down in disgust, and Lydia had felt a wild surge of hope. He'd lost. He'd give back the locket. But Roy wasn't done. Best 2 out of 3, he'd declared, already gathering the cards. But you said, I said shut up. The second hand went the same way, and the third. Each time Roy's anger grew, fed by the whiskey and his own incompetence. He'd lost to himself, and somehow that was the ultimate humiliation. This is your fault, he'd snarled suddenly, sweeping the cards off the table. You and your goddamn locket. Bad luck. That's what you are. Bad luck from the moment you stepped off that train. Roy, please, just give it back. And the back of his hand caught her across the face, splitting her lip. Shut your mouth, woman. But he hadn't stopped there. The rage that had been building all winter, fed by whiskey and isolation and his own failures, erupted like a volcano. He'd grabbed her by the hair, dragging her across the floor. His fists had rained down, and she'd tried to protect herself, curling into a ball. But it wasn't enough. She'd heard something crack, a rib, maybe. And pain had exploded through her chest. She'd tasted blood, felt it running down her face. The world had gone fuzzy at the edges, gray and distant. And then, suddenly, she was being dragged toward the door. You want this locket so bad? Roy had roared. Fine. Go get it. He'd thrown the door open, and the winter storm had howled in, blinding white, vicious cold. Through her dimming vision, Lydia had seen him hurl the locket out into the blizzard. The gold had glinted once in the lamplight, then vanished into the swirling snow. No, she'd whispered. No, please. Go on. Roy had grabbed her by the collar of her dress, hauling her toward the open door. You want it so bad. Go get it, and don't come back until you find it. Roy, I'll die out there, please. Should have thought of that before you brought your bad luck into my house. And then she was flying through the air, thrown out into the storm like garbage. She'd hit the snow hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Behind her, she'd heard the door slam shut, the bar dropping into place. She'd tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. The cold hit like a physical force, stealing her breath, her strength, her hope. Snow fell thick and fast, already covering her tracks, erasing any sign that she'd ever existed. Somewhere out there was her mother's locket, her last connection to love, to kindness, to anything good in this world. On hands and knees, bleeding and broken, Lydia began to crawl into the storm. She didn't know how long she crawled. Time lost all meaning in the white hell of the blizzard. Minutes could have been hours. Hours could have been minutes. All she knew was the cold, cold that burned like fire, that stole feeling from her fingers and toes, that turned her breath to ice in her lungs. She'd searched for the locket at first, her frozen hands patting through the snow, desperately seeking that glint of gold. But the storm was too fierce, the snow too deep. It was gone. Her mother was gone. Everything was gone. And still she crawled, because stopping meant dying, and some stubborn part of her refused to give Roy Anderson that satisfaction. The wind howled, driving snow into her face, her mouth, her nose. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. She didn't even know which direction she was going. Away from the shack, yes, but toward what? There was nothing out here, just endless white emptiness and death waiting in the cold. Her mother's voice came to her then, a memory so clear it was almost real. Don't give up, baby. Don't ever give up. You're stronger than you know. I'm not strong, Mama, she'd whispered into the storm. I'm not strong at all. But she kept crawling. Her vision was starting to go gray at the edges, like looking through a tunnel that was slowly closing. Her hands and feet were numb. She couldn't feel the cold anymore, which some distant part of her brain knew was a bad sign. When you stopped feeling the cold, it meant you were dying. Maybe that wasn't so bad. Maybe it would be peaceful, just lying down in the snow and letting go. No more pain, no more fear, no more Roy Anderson. She'd almost stopped then. Almost let herself sink into the white and the gray and the quiet. But then, Through the swirling snow, she'd seen something. A shape in the darkness. A straight line where there shouldn't be straight lines in nature. A fence. Hope, tiny and fragile as a candle flame in a storm, flickered to life. A fence meant property. Property meant people. People meant help. She'd crawled toward it, her frozen hands reaching, grasping. When her fingers finally closed around the rough wood, she'd wanted to weep with relief. But there were no tears left. They'd frozen on her cheeks long ago. Using the fence, she'd pulled herself upright, standing on legs that felt like they might shatter. Through the storm, she'd seen it, a light in the distance, a lamp in a window, the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Help, she'd tried to call, but her voice was barely a whisper, stolen by the wind. She'd taken one step toward that light, then another. Her legs gave out, and she fell face first into the snow. She'd gotten up, fell again, got up again. The light seemed to be getting farther away instead of closer, but she kept going because what else was there to do? One more step, just one more. And then another, and another. The light grew brighter, closer. She could see the shape of a building now, a cabin, solidly built, with smoke rising from the chimney. So different from Roy's shack, so impossibly far away. She'd fallen again, and this time she couldn't get up. Her body simply wouldn't respond anymore. She'd given everything she had, and it wasn't enough. "I'm sorry, Mama," she'd thought as the gray closed in. "I tried. I really tried." The snow had started to cover her, a cold blanket pulling her down into darkness. But as consciousness faded, one last thought flickered through her mind. A prayer, or maybe just a desperate hope cast into the void. Please. Someone. Anyone. Please. And then there was nothing but white and cold and the merciful darkness of oblivion. Dawn came slowly to the Wyoming plains, gray light seeping through the storm like water through cloth. The blizzard had blown itself out sometime in the night, leaving behind a world transformed, silent, white, and deadly beautiful. The temperature had dropped even further, the kind of cold that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't prepared. Ezra Collins had been awake since before first light, as was his habit. At 43, he'd lived alone on this land for nearly 5 years now, ever since Sarah had passed, and the routines of solitary life had become as natural as breathing. He'd stoked the fire, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and stood at his window watching the last of the snowfall while the sky turned from black to gray to the pale blue of a winter morning. It was going to be a hard day. The storm had dumped at least 2 feet of snow, maybe more in the drifts, and his livestock would need tending. The horses would need to be fed and watered, the barn checked for damage, the paths cleared. The work of survival never stopped, not even for a blizzard. He dressed in layers: wool undershirt, heavy flannel, a canvas coat lined with sheepskin, boots that came up to his knees. He'd wound a scarf around his face and pulled on gloves that Sarah had made him years ago, the leather worn soft with use. Then he'd stepped out into the cold. The world was hushed, muffled by snow. His breath came in white clouds, freezing in his beard almost instantly. The sun was just cresting the horizon, turning the snow pink and gold, and for a moment Ezra had simply stood there, taking in the terrible beauty of it. Then he'd gotten to work. The horses were restless, stamping and snorting in their stalls, glad to see him. He'd broken the ice on their water trough, filled their feed bins, checked them for any signs of injury or frostbite. His mare, a dappled gray named Ash, had nuzzled his shoulder while he worked, her warm breath a comfort in the cold. "I know, girl," he'd murmured, stroking her neck. "Hell of a storm, wasn't it?" The chickens were next, huddled together in their coop for warmth. He'd scattered feed and refilled their water, counting heads to make sure none had frozen in the night. All present and accounted for. Small mercies. He'd been heading back to the cabin, thinking about breakfast and maybe another cup of coffee, when he'd seen it. At first he'd thought it was just a drift. Snow piled up against the fence line in a strange shape, but something about it had caught his eye, some irregularity that didn't match the natural patterns of wind-blown snow. He'd stopped, squinting against the glare. The drift was the wrong color, not pure white, but darker, stained. His heart had begun to pound even before his brain caught up. He'd started running, high-stepping through the deep snow, his breath coming hard. As he got closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made his blood run cold. A body. Half buried in the snow, curled on its side against his fence. A woman's body, from the looks of it, small, dressed in nothing but a thin dress that was frozen stiff. The snow around her was stained red with blood. Jesus Christ, he'd breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. He'd pulled off his glove, pressing his fingers to her throat, not expecting to find anything. But there it was, a pulse, faint and thready, but there. She was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. "Can you hear me?" he'd asked, knowing she couldn't, but needing to say something. "I've got you. You're going to be all right." He'd scooped her up as gently as he could, shocked by how light she was, how cold. Her skin was blue-white, her lips nearly purple. She was frozen solid, rigid in his arms like a statue. How long had she been out here? How was she not dead? He'd carried her back to the cabin as fast as he could move through the snow, shouldering through the door and kicking it shut behind him. The warmth hit like a wall, and he'd known immediately that warming her too fast could be just as dangerous as the cold itself. He'd laid her on the floor in front of the fire, far enough back that the heat wouldn't be direct. Her clothes were frozen to her body, the fabric stiff and crackling. He'd have to get them off, get her warm, but carefully. Too fast and her heart could stop. His hands had moved with practiced efficiency, though inside his chest his heart was racing. He'd cut away the frozen dress with his knife. It was ruined anyway, stiff with ice and stained with blood. Underneath, her skin was mottled with purple and white patches. Frostbite. Bad frostbite on her hands and feet especially. He'd wrapped her in blankets from his bed, then added the quilt Sarah had made, the one he usually kept folded at the foot of the bed like a shrine. He'd built up the fire, filled a pot with snow to melt for warm water, and then he'd simply knelt there beside her, watching her breathe. Because she was breathing. Shallow and slow, but breathing. "What the hell happened to you?" he'd asked the unconscious woman. "Who did this?" The bruises told part of the story. Her face was swollen and cut, one eye black, her lip split. There were bruises on her arms, her ribs, her throat, hand-shaped bruises like someone had grabbed her, hit her, choked her. Someone had beaten this woman nearly to death. And then, what? Thrown her out into the storm? Rage had kindled in Ezra's chest, hot and fierce. He was a peaceful man by nature, slow to anger, but the sight of this broken woman on his floor woke something primal in him. Whoever had done this deserved to be horsewhipped, deserved worse than that. But first, she needed to survive. He'd heated water on the stove, not too hot, just barely warm. Using a cloth, he'd carefully cleaned the blood from her face, assessing the damage. Her lip would heal, the black eye would fade. The cut on her cheekbone might scar, but it wasn't deep. The bruises were bad, but not life-threatening. The cold was the real danger now. And the frostbite. He'd seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite, seen the blackened flesh that meant amputation was the only option. He'd prayed he wouldn't see that here. He'd warmed water bottles by the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them carefully under the blankets near her core, her chest, her stomach, under her arms. Not touching her skin directly, just radiating heat slowly, gently. Her body needed time to remember what warmth felt like. Hours had passed. Ezra had kept vigil beside her, tending the fire, replacing the water bottles as they cooled, watching for any change. Outside, the sun had risen higher, the day advancing without any acknowledgement of the drama playing out in this small cabin. Around noon, she'd made a sound. Small, almost inaudible, a moan of pain. But it was the most beautiful sound Ezra had heard in years because it meant consciousness, meant her brain was still working. "Easy now," he'd said softly, not wanting to startle her. "You're safe. You're inside. You're warm. Don't try to move yet." Her eyelids had fluttered, but didn't open. Another moan, and then she'd gone still again. But it was progress, life asserting itself against the cold. He'd made broth, beef bone broth that he'd had simmering on the stove since yesterday, rich and salty and nourishing. When it had cooled enough, he'd carefully lifted her head, supporting it with one hand, and brought a spoonful to her lips. "Come on," he'd murmured. "Just a little. You need this." Most of it had dribbled down her chin, but some went in. He'd tried again and again, patient, persistent, a spoonful at a time, letting her body remember what food was. By late afternoon, color had begun to return to her face. The deadly blue-white was fading to something more human. Her breathing had deepened, steadied. Her fingers, which had been rigid and frozen, had relaxed slightly. She was going to make it. Against all odds, this woman was going to survive. Ezra had sat back against the wall, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day was fading, leaving him shaky and tired. He'd looked at the stranger sleeping in his blankets and wondered who she was, where she'd come from, who had hurt her so badly, and what the hell he was supposed to do now. The sun was setting, painting the snow outside gold and pink and purple, when she'd finally opened her eyes. At first there was just confusion in them, green eyes, he noticed, the color of spring grass. Then fear flooded in, pure and primal. She tried to sit up, to scramble away, but her body wouldn't obey. A cry of pain escaped her lips. "Easy," Ezra had said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy now. You're all right. You're safe." But she didn't look like she believed that. She was looking around wildly, taking in the cabin, the fire, the blankets wrapped around her, and him, a strange man she'd never seen before. Her breathing had quickened, panic setting in. "My name is Ezra Collins," he'd said, keeping his voice low and calm, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse. "You were outside in the storm. I found you by my fence this morning, half frozen to death. I brought you inside to warm you up. You're safe here. I promise you're safe." She'd stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her trying to process this information, trying to remember. Then her hand had moved to her throat, patting, searching. Her eyes had widened in distress. "My locket," she'd whispered, her voice raw and broken. "My mother's locket. I have to—" She'd tried to sit up again, and Ezra had gently pressed her shoulder. "You need to stay still. You've got frostbite, maybe some broken ribs. Moving around is only going to make it worse." "But my locket—" Was there a locket out there? He'd kept his voice gentle. "I didn't see one, but it was dark and snowing. I can look again when the weather clears, but right now you need to focus on getting better." Tears had begun streaming down her face then, silent and heartbroken. "It's gone. Everything's gone." Ezra had felt something twist in his chest. He'd been alone a long time, had gotten good at not feeling too much, but something about this woman's grief cut through all his carefully maintained distance. "What's your name?" he'd asked quietly. She'd been silent for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, "Lydia. Lydia Hartwell." "Well, Lydia Hartwell, you've had a hell of a night, but you're alive. And that's what matters right now. Everything else we can figure out later." "Where—" She'd looked around again, and he could see her cataloging details. The solid walls, the good stove, the furniture that was simple but well made, the books on the shelf by the window. "Where am I?" "You're at my homestead, about 6 miles southwest of Bitter Creek. You were by my fence line when I found you. Do you remember what happened?" Her face had closed then, shutting down like a door slamming. The storm. I was in the storm." There was more to it. The bruises made that clear, but Ezra hadn't pushed. Whatever had happened to put her out in that blizzard, she'd tell him when she was ready. Or she wouldn't. Either way, it was her story to share. "Are you hungry?" he'd asked instead. "I've got broth on the stove. It's not much, but it'll help get your strength back." She'd nodded slightly, and he'd fetched a bowl, helping her sit up enough to drink. She'd winced with every movement, her ribs clearly causing her pain, but she'd managed to get some of the broth down. "Thank you," she'd whispered when she'd had enough. "Nothing to thank me for. Any decent person would do the same." But even as he'd said it, he'd known it wasn't quite true. There were plenty of men out here who wouldn't have helped, who would have seen a woman alone and vulnerable and taken advantage. The frontier attracted all kinds, and not all of them were good. She'd fallen asleep again after that, exhausted by even that small effort. Ezra had sat by the fire, watching her sleep, and thought about what he'd gotten himself into. The situation was complicated. A strange woman in his cabin, clearly running from something or someone. No proper chaperone, no husband or family to speak for her. In a town like Bitter Creek, where gossip spread faster than wildfire, this could ruin both their reputations. But what was he supposed to do? Throw her back out into the snow, take her into town and dump her at the church? She was hurt, vulnerable, and clearly terrified of something. No. Whatever complications this brought, he'd deal with them. Right now, she needed help, and he had it to give. That was all that mattered. The next days settled into a rhythm that was strange but not unpleasant. Lydia slept most of the time, her body demanding rest as it healed. When she was awake, Ezra brought her food, broth at first, then bread soaked in milk, then soft scrambled eggs. Small meals, easy to digest, gradually building her strength back up. He'd set up a screen in the corner, a frame with a blanket draped over it, to give her privacy when she needed to use the chamber pot or change clothes. He'd given her one of his old shirts to sleep in, the fabric soft with age and washing, and it hung on her like a dress. They didn't talk much. Ezra wasn't much for conversation even at the best of times. 5 years alone had made him comfortable with silence, and Lydia seemed locked in her own head, somewhere far away. But he noticed things about her. The way she startled at sudden sounds, the way she tracked his movements whenever he was in the room, like she was always calculating escape routes. The nightmares that woke her gasping in the dark, though she never spoke of what she'd dreamed. She'd been hurt badly, and not just by the cold. Someone had broken something in her, and it was going to take more than warm broth and clean blankets to fix it. A week passed. The frostbite on her hands and feet had turned out to be moderate, painful and slow to heal, but not severe enough to cause permanent damage. The bruises were fading from purple-black to yellow-green. The cut on her face was scabbing over. She was mending, at least physically. On the 8th day, he'd woken to find her sitting up by the fire, wrapped in the quilt, staring into the flames. It was early, the sun wasn't up yet, and he'd thought she was asleep. "Can't sleep it?" he'd asked quietly. She jumped at his voice, then shook her head. "Nightmares." He'd sat down in his chair, keeping a respectful distance. "Want to talk about it?" "No." "Fair enough." He'd poured himself coffee, offered her some, which she'd declined. They'd sat in silence, watching the fire, until the sky began to lighten outside. "Why are you helping me?" she'd asked suddenly. Ezra had considered the question. "Why wouldn't I? You don't know me. I could be anyone. A criminal, a liar, someone bringing trouble to your door." "Could be," he'd agreed. "Are you?" "No. But you don't know that. I know you were half dead in the snow. I know someone beat you badly and left you to die. I know you're scared and hurting and alone." He'd looked at her then, really looked at her. "That's all I need to know to help." She'd turned away, but not before he'd seen fresh tears in her eyes. "People don't just help. Everyone wants something." "Not everyone." "Yes, everyone." Her voice had been bitter, hard with experience. "Every kindness comes with a price. Every smile hides teeth. I've learned that lesson well enough." Ezra had been quiet for a moment, thinking about how to respond. "I'm sorry that's been your experience, but I don't want anything from you. You can stay here until you're healed, until you figure out where you want to go next. No strings, no expectations. And then what? You'll just let me leave?" "If that's what you want, yes." She'd studied his face, searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden cost. But whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she'd finally nodded and turned back to the fire. It was a start. As Lydia grew stronger, she began to move around the cabin more. At first, just short trips, to the window to look out at the snow, to the small shelf where Ezra kept his books, to the stove to warm her hands. But gradually, the trips grew longer, and something else began to happen. She started helping. It was small things at first. Ezra would come in from tending the horses to find the dishes washed and stacked by the stove. The next day, the floor had been swept. The day after that, he'd found his shirts, which he'd been meaning to mend for weeks, neatly repaired and folded on his bed. "You don't have to do that," he'd said when he found her darning socks by the fire. "I know," she'd replied, not looking up from her work. "But I need to do something. I can't just sit here being useless." "You're recovering. That's not useless." "It feels useless." She'd nodded off the thread, examining her work. "Besides, you've been taking care of me." The least I can do is help take care of things here. He'd wanted to argue, to tell her she owed him nothing, but he could see the determination in her face. She needed this, needed to feel like she was contributing, like she had value beyond being a burden. So he'd simply nodded. "Appreciate it," he'd said. "Those socks have been needing attention for months." A ghost of a smile had crossed her face, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "You're not much of a seamstress. Never claimed to be." The smile had grown slightly. "I can see that. Your stitching looks like a drunk spider made it." And just like that, something had shifted between them. Not much, just the smallest crack in the wall she'd built around herself. But it was something. The days continued. Lydia grew stronger. She started cooking. Simple things at first, just bread and beans, but then more elaborate meals that reminded Ezra of the days when Sarah was alive and the cabin smelled like home. She'd organized his chaotic pantry, mended every piece of clothing he owned, even made curtains from an old sheet to replace the ones that had worn through years ago. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about the important things, she never mentioned what had happened to her, and he never asked, but about small things, books they'd read, the weather, the horses. She told him about growing up in Nebraska, about her mother who loved to sing. He told her about building this homestead, about the hard first years when he'd thought he might not make it. They didn't talk about Sarah. That grief was still too raw, even after 5 years. But sometimes Lydia would pick up the quilt and run her fingers over the stitching, and he knew she understood there had been someone before, someone who'd left a hole that nothing could fill. 3 weeks after he'd found her, they were sitting by the fire after dinner when she finally asked, "Don't you want to know? What happened to me?" Ezra had looked up from the harness he was mending. "Only if you want to tell me." She'd been quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, emotionless, like she was recounting something that had happened to someone else. "I was married, or supposed to be married. A mail-order arrangement. My stepfather sold me to a man named Roy Anderson, a rancher about 20 miles from here. He said Roy had means, that I'd be comfortable, but it was all lies." She'd told him everything then. The train ride west, meeting Roy at the station, the shack that was supposed to be a ranch, the violence that came with the drinking, the night he'd beaten her and thrown her out into the storm over a locket. Ezra had listened without interrupting, his hands still on the harness, but his mind entirely focused on her words. When she finished, there was a long silence. "Roy Anderson," he'd finally said. "I know the place. Passed it a few times. Didn't know anyone was living there. Thought it was abandoned." "Might as well be," Lydia had said bitterly. "It's a ruin. Everything he told my stepfather was a lie. He's not a successful rancher. He's a drunk with a few starving cattle and a shack that's falling apart." "And you're legally married to him?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Lydia's hands had tightened on the quilt. "I don't know. There was no ceremony, no preacher. He just claimed me. Said paying for my passage made me his wife. Is that legal?" "I don't know," Ezra had admitted. "Law out here is complicated. But even if it is legal, what he did to you isn't. No man has the right to beat his wife, to throw her out to die. That's attempted murder, far as I'm concerned. Who would believe me? I'm just some mail-order bride with no family, no money. He could say anything, that I ran away, that I'm lying, that I tried to steal from him. And his word against mine, like..." She'd shaken her head. Men like Roy always win. Ezra had wanted to argue, to tell her that justice would prevail, that she'd be believed. But he'd lived in the Wyoming territory long enough to know that justice was often as harsh and unpredictable as the weather. She was probably right. "What do you want to do?" he'd asked instead. "I don't know." Her voice had been small, lost. "I have nowhere to go, no money, no way to get back to Nebraska, and even if I could, Silas would just sell me to someone else. I'm trapped." "You're not trapped." He'd set down the harness, giving her his full attention. "You can stay here as long as you need to. I've got room, got food. You're earning your keep with the work you've been doing. It's not a permanent solution maybe, but it's something. People will talk." She'd looked at him seriously. A woman living in a man's cabin, no relation, no chaperone. The gossip will destroy both our reputations. "Let them talk," he'd shrugged. "I don't go into town much anyway, and I don't give a damn what people think." "You say that now." But when the Reverend comes calling, when people start treating you different, refusing to do business with you, then I'll deal with it." He'd leaned forward, his voice intense. "Listen to me, Lydia. You've been to hell and back. You've survived things that would break most people. Don't let fear of what other people might think send you back into danger. Stay. Figure out your next step, and to hell with anyone who has a problem with it." She'd looked at him for a long moment, and he'd seen something shift in her eyes. Hope, maybe. Or just the possibility of hope. "All right," she'd whispered. "All right. I'll stay." And so she did. January turned into February, and the worst of the winter settled in like an unwelcome guest. The days were short and brutally cold, the nights endless. But inside the cabin, something unexpected was growing. Not romance, nothing like that. They were too damaged, both of them, too wary of anything that looked like love. But companionship, partnership, a shared life built on mutual respect and careful distance. They developed rhythms. Ezra would wake first, build up the fire, make coffee. Lydia would cook breakfast while he tended the animals. They'd eat together, mostly in silence, then go about their separate tasks. He'd work the land such as it was in winter, mending fences, chopping wood, maintaining equipment. She'd tend the cabin, cook, mend, read from his small collection of books. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire. Sometimes she'd read aloud. She had a beautiful voice, clear and expressive, and he'd listen while he worked on some project or another. Sometimes they'd play chess on a board he'd carved years ago. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, two people who'd learned that not every moment needed to be filled with words. It was peaceful. Strange, given how it had started, but peaceful nonetheless. But peace never lasts forever on the frontier. The first sign of trouble came in mid-February, when Ezra rode into Bitter Creek for supplies. He'd left Lydia at the cabin. She'd been reluctant to be left alone, but he'd convinced her she'd be safe for the few hours he'd be gone. The town was small, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings. Ezra had tied up his horse and gone into the store, nodding to the few people he passed. But something was different. He could feel it in the way people looked at him, quick glances, then looking away. Whispers that stopped when he got close. By the time he reached the counter, the storekeeper, a man named Henderson, was looking at him with barely concealed disapproval. "Ezra," Henderson had said curtly. "What can I get you?" "Usual supplies, flour, salt, sugar, coffee, if you've got good beans." Henderson had gathered the items without his usual small talk, then tallied up the cost. "That'll be $6 even." Ezra had paid, then asked casually, "Something wrong, Henderson? You seem off today." The storekeeper had hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, Ezra, you and I have always dealt fair, so I'm going to be straight with you. There's talk going around about you and, well, about you having a woman living in your cabin." Ezra's jaw had tightened. News travels fast. "Peterson's oldest boy was out checking his father's north fence line last week. Saw smoke from your chimney and a woman hanging laundry out to dry. Word got around." Henderson had shaken his head. "I don't judge, Ezra. You're a grown man, and what you do on your own land is your business. But the Reverend's been asking questions, and there are some who think, well, they think it's inappropriate, you being a widower and all, and this woman being unmarried and unchaperoned. The woman's name is Lydia, and she's a guest in my home, nothing more. I believe you, but others won't. You know how people are." Henderson had glanced toward the door, then back. "Reverend Blackwood's been talking about paying you a visit. Wants to make sure everything is proper, as he puts it. Just thought you should know." Ezra had gathered his supplies, thanked Henderson for the warning, and headed back home. But the conversation had left him troubled. He'd meant what he said. He didn't care what people thought. But Lydia was already fragile, already scared. The last thing she needed was a self-righteous preacher showing up to pass judgment on her life. He'd decided not to tell her about the conversation. No point worrying her until there was something concrete to worry about. But he'd felt the shadow of the outside world creeping closer to their peaceful refuge, and he'd known it was only a matter of time before it arrived. That time came exactly 1 week later. Ezra had been outside chopping wood when he'd seen the buggy coming up the road. a single horse pulling a covered carriage, moving at a steady pace. He'd known immediately who it was, Reverend Blackwood, coming to make good on his threat to pay a visit. He'd set down the axe and waited, watching the buggy approach. Inside the cabin, he knew Lydia would be hearing it too, would be wondering what was happening. He'd hoped she'd stay inside, at least until he could assess the situation. The buggy had pulled up in front of the cabin, and Reverend Blackwood had climbed down. He was a tall, thin man with a severe face and eyes that seemed to judge everything they saw. He wore a black suit despite the cold and carried a Bible under one arm. "Mr. Collins," he'd said, his voice as cold as the wind. "I trust you know why I'm here." "Reverend." Ezra had kept his voice neutral. "Can't say as I do, but you're welcome to speak your piece. There are reports, credible reports, that you have a woman living in your cabin, an unmarried woman with no chaperone or proper supervision. As a man of God and a shepherd to this community, I felt it my duty to investigate these claims and, if necessary, to counsel you on the proper Christian conduct." Ezra had felt anger kindle in his chest, but he'd kept it locked down. Losing his temper wouldn't help anyone. "Her name is Lydia Hartwell. She was caught in that blizzard about a month ago, nearly froze to death. I found her by my fence line and brought her inside to save her life. She's been recovering here since." "And her husband? Her family?" "She has neither. She's alone." Blackwood's expression had grown even more severe. "Then the proper thing would have been to bring her into town, to the church. We have women there who could have cared for her, properly and decorously. Instead, you've kept her here, unchaperoned, living under your roof. Surely you can see how this appears." "I can see how it appears to people who look for scandal in every shadow," Ezra had replied, his voice hardening slightly. "But I don't much care about appearances. I care about what's right. And letting a woman freeze to death because it might look improper to help her isn't right in my book. No one is suggesting you should have let her die. But there are proper ways to handle these situations, ways that preserve both her reputation and yours. By keeping her here, alone with you, you've compromised her virtue and your own standing in the community." "My standing in the community?" Ezra had laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Reverend, I haven't been to church in 5 years. I keep to myself. I don't bother anyone, and I don't much care what anyone thinks of me. If people want to gossip, let them. But Lydia stays here until she's well enough and ready enough to decide for herself where she wants to go." The door to the cabin had opened then, and Lydia had stepped out. She was wrapped in a shawl, her face still showing the fading bruises from Roy's beating. But she held herself straight, her chin up, her eyes clear. "Reverend Blackwood," she'd said quietly. "I'm Lydia Hartwell. I understand you have concerns about my presence here." Blackwood had turned to her, and something in his expression had softened slightly at the sight of her obvious injuries. "Miss Hartwell, are you here of your own free will? Has Mr. Collins treated you properly?" "He saved my life," Lydia had said simply. "And yes, I'm here of my own free will. Mr. Collins has been nothing but kind and respectful. He's given me shelter, food, and asked nothing in return. Whatever you've heard, whatever people are saying, the truth is much simpler than the gossip. He's a good man who helped someone in need." "Be that as it may," Blackwood had said, though his voice was less certain now. "The situation is still improper. You're an unmarried woman living with an unmarried man. In the eyes of the community, and in the eyes of God, this arrangement is unacceptable." "Then what would you have me do?" Lydia had asked. "Where would you have me go?" "The church can provide accommodation. There are families in town who would take in a mail-order bride running from a violent husband?" Lydia had interrupted, her voice sharp now. "Who would welcome a woman with no money, no family, no prospects? You speak of Christian charity, Reverend, but where was that charity when I was being beaten? Where was it when I was thrown out to die in the snow?" Blackwood had flushed. "If we had known, you know now. And your concern isn't for my safety or my well-being. It's for appearances, for your comfort, for your reputation." She'd stepped forward, and despite her small size, there was something fierce in her eyes. "Mr. Collins didn't worry about appearances when he found me dying. He didn't think about his reputation when he saved my life. He just did what needed to be done. If that offends your sense of propriety, then I'm sorry, but I won't apologize for surviving." There had been a long silence. The wind had whistled through the trees, carrying snow from the branches. Ezra had watched Lydia face down the Reverend, feeling something like pride swelling in his chest. She'd found her strength again, this woman. Found her voice. "I see," Blackwood had finally said, his voice cold again. "Then I've made my position clear, and you've made yours. But know this, the community will not look kindly on this arrangement. You'll both find yourselves the subject of gossip and judgment. And if Miss Hartwell's husband, you said, comes looking for her, the law may not be on your side." "Let him come," Ezra had said quietly, "and let the law decide. But she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Blackwood had climbed back into his buggy, his face set in disapproving lines. "I'll pray for you both," he'd said, though it had sounded more like a threat than a blessing. "Good day." They'd watched him drive away, the buggy disappearing down the road. When he was out of sight, Lydia had let out a long breath, and Ezra had seen her hands shaking. "That went well," she'd said, and there had been a slight tremor in her voice that belied her brave words. "You did good," Ezra had told her. "Stood up to him. Not many people have the guts to do that. I shouldn't have spoken to him that way. Now he'll tell everyone I'm difficult, unrepentant. It'll make things worse." Things were already going to be bad. At least now he knows we won't be pushed around. He'd picked up the axe again, then set it down, looking at her seriously. But he had a point about one thing. If Roy comes looking for you, if he claims you as his wife, the law might side with him. We need to be prepared for that. Lydia had wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders, her face troubled. "I know. I've been thinking about it, about what I'll do if he comes." "What will you do?" She'd looked at him, and in her eyes he'd seen the woman who'd survived a beating, survived a blizzard, survived everything life had thrown at her. "I won't go back. Whatever happens, whatever it costs, I won't go back to that." "Good," Ezra had said simply. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes." And standing there in the snow, with the Reverend's disapproval still hanging in the air like wood smoke, they'd made a silent pact. Two broken people, standing against the world. It wasn't love, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was something just as powerful. It was choice, and it was defiance. And it was the first day Lydia Hartwell truly believed she might actually survive this after all. The days after Reverend Blackwood's visit carried a different weight. It wasn't that anything had changed inside the cabin. The routines remained the same, the quiet companionship continued, but both Ezra and Lydia felt the eyes of the world pressing closer, judging, waiting for them to stumble. True to Blackwood's prediction, the gossip spread like wildfire through Bitter Creek and the surrounding homesteads. The next time Ezra went into town for supplies, the cold shoulders were more pronounced. Mrs. Henderson, who'd always been friendly, barely met his eyes when she sold him thread and needles for Lydia. The men at the grain depot loaded his wagon in silence, their mouths tight with disapproval. Only one person spoke to him directly about it, old Tom Miller, whose ranch bordered Ezra's property to the east. Tom had caught up with him as he was leaving town, his weathered face creased with concern. "Ezra, hold up a minute," Tom had called, spurring his horse alongside the wagon. Ezra had pulled the reins, waiting. Tom was a good man, fair and honest, and one of the few neighbors Ezra actually respected. "I'm not here to judge," Tom had said without preamble. "God knows we've all done things that raised eyebrows, but I wanted to give you some friendly advice, man to man." "Appreciate it, Tom." "That woman you've got staying with you, Lydia, I heard her name is. People are saying she's married to Roy Anderson." Ezra's hands had tightened on the reins. "You know Roy?" "Know of him. He's a mean drunk, from what I've heard. Gambles more than he ranches. Got himself a reputation in Bitter Creek for starting fights." Tom had shifted in his saddle, choosing his words carefully. "If she's running from him, I don't blame her one bit. But legally speaking, if they're married, he's got rights. If he comes for her, the law will back him up, no matter what kind of man he is." There was no ceremony, no preacher, no witnesses. He just claimed her because he paid for her passage west. Tom had grimaced. Common law marriage. It's murky, but out here a lot of judges would consider that binding, especially if he's got papers showing he paid for her travel. He'd paused, then added quietly, "Look, I'm not saying what's right or wrong. I'm just saying be careful. Roy's the type to make trouble when he's been crossed. And if he shows up with the law on his side, I understand. Thanks for the warning. One more thing. Tom had glanced around to make sure no one was in earshot. My wife and I, we think what you're doing is decent. Helping someone in need, that's Christian charity in action, no matter what Blackwood says. If you need anything, a witness to her character, a place for her to stay if things get complicated, you let us know. The offer had meant more than Ezra could put into words. Thank you, Tom. That means a lot. Just don't be a stranger. And Ezra? Tom's eyes had been serious. Watch your back. Roy Anderson isn't the only one talking. There are some who think you've wronged him by taking his wife, and some of those men are the type to take matters into their own hands. Ezra had driven home through the late afternoon, Tom's words echoing in his mind. He'd known the situation was complicated, but he hadn't fully considered how dangerous it might become. Not just for Lydia, but for both of them. When he'd arrived back at the cabin, he'd found Lydia in the small garden plot she'd been preparing near the house. Despite the cold, she'd cleared the snow from a section of earth and was turning the soil with a spade, preparing it for spring planting. "You'll freeze out here," he'd called, hauling the supplies down from the wagon. "The sun's out. Feels good to work with the earth again." She'd straighten, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "How was town?" "Complicated." He'd decided to be honest with her. "People are talking. Tom Miller warned me that Roy might come looking for you. Said the law might back him up if he claims you're his wife." The color had drained from Lydia's face, but she'd kept her voice steady. "I figured as much. Did Tom say anything else?" "That Roy's got a reputation for causing trouble. That we should watch our backs." He'd carried a sack of flour toward the cabin, then stopped and turned to look at her. "Lydia, if you want to leave, if you think it'd be safer somewhere else, I'll help you. I've got a little money saved, enough to get you to Denver maybe, or even back to Nebraska if that's what you want." She'd stabbed the spade into the dirt, leaving it standing upright. "I told you, I'm not going back to Nebraska, and I'm not running to Denver to start over with nothing. I'm tired of running, Ezra. I'm tired of being afraid. Being brave is one thing. Being foolish is another. If Roy comes, then I'll deal with it. I'll face him. But I won't let him chase me away from the only place I've felt safe in months." She'd walk toward him, her green eyes fierce. "Unless you want me to go. If I'm putting you in danger, if this is too much trouble, just say so. I'll leave tonight if that's what you want." "That's not what I want." "Then what do you want?" The question had hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Ezra had set down the flour sack, straightening to his full height. "I want you to be safe. I want you to be happy. And if staying here does that, then you stay. Everything else we'll figure out as it comes." Something had shifted in her expression then, a softening, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "You're a good man, Ezra Collins. Better than you probably know." "I'm just doing what anyone should do?" "No. You're doing what you think is right, regardless of the cost. That's not something everyone does." She'd picked up the spade again. "I'm staying, and I'm planting this garden, because I plan to be here to harvest it come summer." It was a declaration of intent, a line drawn in the earth. And watching her turn back to her work, Ezra had felt something he hadn't felt in 5 long years. Hope. Not for himself necessarily, but for the future. For the possibility that something good could grow from all this pain. February melted into March, and with it came the first tentative signs of spring. The snow began to recede, leaving patches of brown earth that steamed in the sun. The creek swelled with meltwater, rushing and tumbling over rocks. Birds returned, their songs filling the morning air, and slowly, carefully, the relationship between Ezra and Lydia continued to deepen. Declarations of feeling, both of them were too scarred for that, too wary of the pain that seemed to follow love like a shadow. But there was something else, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding, a friendship forged in the crucible of survival. They worked together seamlessly now. Ezra would plan the day's tasks, and Lydia would help execute them without needing to be asked. She'd learned to handle the chickens, gathering eggs and scattering feed with practiced efficiency. She'd taken over the cooking entirely, and Ezra's meals had improved dramatically. She had a gift for making even the simplest ingredients taste special. In the evenings, they'd taken to sitting outside on the porch when the weather allowed, watching the sun set over the plains. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Lydia finally told him about her mother. She was beautiful, Lydia had said softly, her eyes on the horizon. Not just in her face, but in her spirit. She used to sing while she worked, hymns mostly, but sometimes old folk songs her own mother had taught her. Even when things were hard, she'd find something to sing about. What happened to her? Ezra had asked gently. My father died when I was 12. Pneumonia took him fast. One week he was fine, the next he was gone. Mama tried to keep the farm going, but it was too much work, too much debt. She had to sell. Lydia's voice had grown distant, lost in memory. That's when Silas came around. He was a widower, had money, seemed respectable. Mama married him thinking he'd take care of us. But he changed after the wedding, or maybe he just stopped pretending to be decent. He hurt her? Not physically. Not often, anyway. But there are other ways to hurt someone. He'd belittle her, mock her faith, tell her she was worthless. He'd spend money on himself while she mended the same dress over and over because he wouldn't buy her a new one. Lydia's hands had tightened on the porch railing. She got quieter every year, stopped singing, stopped smiling, and then 2 winters ago she caught a fever. The doctor said it was influenza, but I think she just gave up. I think the fight went out of her, and she let herself slip away. I'm sorry. After she died, Silas didn't even pretend to care about me anymore. I was just a burden, another mouth to feed. When Roy's letter came, he saw his chance to be rid of me and make a profit at the same time. She'd turned to look at Ezra. That's why I won't go back. Because going back means admitting he was right, that I'm worthless, that I'm nothing more than property to be bought and sold. Ezra had been quiet for a long moment, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Finally, he'd said, My Sarah died 5 years ago, come June. Cancer. Started in her breast, spread everywhere. The doctor said there was nothing to be done except keep her comfortable. It was the first time he'd spoken Sarah's name aloud in years. Lydia had turned to him, listening. She was strong, my Sarah, fought right up until the end. But watching her fade, watching her hurt, that was the hardest thing I've ever done. His voice had roughened with emotion. After she was gone, I couldn't bear to be around people. Couldn't stand their pity, their sympathy. So I stayed out here, kept to myself. Told myself I was fine alone. Were you? Fine alone? No. But I convinced myself I was. It's easier that way, you know. Easier to be alone than to risk caring about someone again. Lydia had reached over then, her hand covering his on the railing. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily, the first real physical contact between them that wasn't born of necessity or medical care. Her hand was small and warm, and Ezra had felt something crack in his chest, not breaking, but opening. Thank you, she'd said quietly, for telling me, for trusting me with that. They'd sat there as the stars came out, hands touching on the railing, 2 wounded souls finding comfort in shared grief. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was connection, and that was something neither of them had expected to find again. The peace lasted until the first week of April, when trouble finally found them. Ezra had been mending the fence line on the eastern border of his property, replacing posts that had rotted over the winter. It was hard, satisfying work, digging holes, setting posts, stretching wire. The kind of work that occupied the hands and freed the mind. He'd been so focused on his task that he hadn't heard the riders approaching until they were nearly upon him. He'd looked up to find 3 men on horseback, watching him with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile. He'd recognized one of them immediately, Ben Carter, who worked at the saloon in Bitter Creek and had a reputation for being quick with his fists. The other 2 were strangers, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of those who'd lived on the wrong side of the law. Help you gentlemen with something? Ezra had asked, setting down his post-hole digger and straightening to his full height. He wasn't a small man, and he'd learned long ago that projecting confidence could sometimes prevent trouble. Ezra Collins? Carter had asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. That's right. We're looking for a woman, About this tall, dark hair, green eyes, goes by the name of Lydia, heard she might be staying with you. Ezra's muscles had tensed. And who's asking? We represent Roy Anderson. He says the woman's his wife, that she ran off and he wants her back. That's so? And where's Roy? Too cowardly to come get her himself. One of the strangers had leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting meaningfully on the pistol at his hip. Watch your mouth, friend. We're here on legitimate business. Roy's got papers proving he paid for the woman's passage, which makes her his legal wife under territorial law. Now, you can hand her over peacefully, or this can get unpleasant. She's not property to be handed over. She's a human being with the right to decide her own future, and she's decided she's not going back to a man who beat her half to death and threw her out to die. Carter had shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He might have been a bully, but he wasn't entirely without conscience. Look, Collins, we're just doing a job. Roy paid us good money to bring his wife back. Says you're the one who kidnapped her, turned her against him. We don't want trouble, but we got a job to do. Then you better get ready for trouble, because she's not leaving this property unless she chooses to. The stranger with his hand on his pistol had smiled then, a cold, dangerous expression. That's the thing about choices, Collins. Sometimes people don't get to make them. Now, we can do this easy. You bring the woman out, we take her back to her husband, everybody goes home happy. Or we can do it hard. We take her anyway, and you end up with a bullet in your belly and your homestead burned to the ground. Your choice. Ezra had felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce. These men weren't lawmen. They were hired thugs, probably promised whiskey and money for bringing Lydia back. The fact that Roy had sent them instead of coming himself told Ezra everything he needed to know about the coward's character. Get off my land, Ezra had said, his voice low and dangerous. And tell Roy Anderson that if he wants Lydia, he can come get her himself. But he'd better come prepared, because I won't let him take her without a fight. The stranger had drawn his pistol then, pointing it casually at Ezra's chest. Last chance, Collins. John, put the gun away, Carter had said nervously. This wasn't supposed to involve shooting. Stay out of it, Carter. John had cocked the hammer. Now, Collins, I'm going to count to 3. The rifle shot had cracked through the air like thunder, and John's hat had flown off his head. All 3 men had whirled to see Lydia standing on the porch of the cabin, Ezra's Winchester held steady at her shoulder, a wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. The next one goes through your skull instead of your hat, she'd called out, her voice clear and strong. Now get off this property before I show you what a Nebraska farm girl can do with a rifle. For a long moment, nobody had moved. Then John had slowly uncocked his pistol and holstered it. This isn't over, he'd snarled. Roy's going to hear about this. And when he does, he can come talk to me himself, Lydia had interrupted. I'm not afraid of him anymore. And I'm not his wife. I never was. He bought a ticket west, not a woman. If he can't understand the difference, that's his problem. Carter had already started turning his horse. Come on, boys. This is more trouble than it's worth. The 3 men had ridden off, and Ezra had stood there watching them go until they were just dust on the horizon. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin, where Lydia was lowering the rifle with shaking hands. That was dangerous, he'd said, climbing the porch steps. So was facing them down alone. She'd set the rifle aside, and he could see the fear in her eyes now that the adrenaline was fading. I saw them from the window, saw them threatening you. I couldn't just hide inside and let you face them alone. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? My father taught me. Said every farm girl should know how to handle a gun. A ghost of a smile had crossed her face. I'm out of practice, but apparently not too rusty. You took his hat clean off at what, 200 yards? I was aiming for his shoulder. Guess my aim's worse than I thought. Despite the tension, despite the danger they'd just faced, Ezra had laughed. It was a real laugh, full and genuine, the first he'd managed since Sarah died. And Lydia had laughed too. And for a moment the fear had lifted, and there was just the absurd humor of the situation. A woman who'd been beaten and left for dead, now shooting hats off hired thugs. But the laughter had faded quickly, replaced by grim reality. They'll be back, Lydia had said. Or Roy will come himself. This isn't over. No, it's not. Ezra had picked up the rifle, checking the ammunition. "But we've got time to prepare. They won't try again today, and Roy's too much of a coward to come alone. He'll need to gather more men or get the law on his side." "What do we do?" "We get ready, and we figure out our next move." That night, they'd sat up late planning. Ezra had checked all his weapons, 2 rifles, a shotgun, and his service revolver from the war. He'd shown Lydia where he kept the ammunition, how to load each gun quickly, the best defensive positions around the cabin. "I don't want to kill anyone," Lydia had said quietly as she practiced loading the Winchester. "Neither do I. But if it comes down to your life or theirs, I won't hesitate, and neither should you." They'd barricaded the door that night, and Ezra had slept, if you could call it sleep, in the chair by the window with the shotgun across his lap. Every sound had him tensing, waiting for the attack he was sure would come, but the night had passed quietly, and dawn had brought only the usual sounds of morning, birds singing, chickens clucking, the wind rustling through the new grass. For 3 days, they'd waited in tense anticipation. Ezra had stayed close to the cabin, doing only the most essential chores. Lydia had kept watch from the windows, the rifle always within reach. They'd barely slept, taking turns keeping guard, starting at every sound. But nothing happened. No riders appeared on the horizon. No threats materialized. Just 3 days of nerve-wracking waiting. On the 4th day, Tom Miller had ridden up, his face grave. "Thought you should know," he'd said without preamble. "Roy Anderson was in town yesterday, drinking and talking big. Says his wife ran off, that you stole her from him. He's trying to get the sheriff involved, claims you kidnapped her." "Did the sheriff listen?" Ezra had asked. "Sheriff Thompson's no fool. He knows Roy's reputation, but the law's the law, and if Roy can prove they're married, Thompson might have to intervene." Tom had glanced at the cabin, where Lydia was watching from the window. "Has she got any proof they're not legally married? Any witnesses to say there was no ceremony?" "Nothing concrete, just her word against his." Tom had been quiet for a moment, then said, "My wife had an idea. It's not a permanent solution, but it might buy you some time. If Lydia agreed to work for us, officially, with a contract, she'd have a legitimate reason to be away from Roy. She'd be an employed woman, not a runaway wife. It might muddy the legal waters enough to keep the sheriff from acting." It was a generous offer, and Ezra had been touched by it, but Lydia had come out onto the porch then, having heard the conversation. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," she'd said, "but I can't keep running from this, and I can't keep pulling good people into my troubles. Roy needs to be faced, and I need to be the one to do it." "That's brave talk," Tom had said gently, "but bravery doesn't stop bullets." "Maybe not, but living in fear isn't living at all." She'd straightened her shoulders. "If Roy wants to talk, let him come talk. But I won't go with him. I won't be forced back into that hell, no matter what the law says." Tom had looked between them, then nodded slowly. "All right. But my offer stands if you change your mind, and Collins, watch yourself. Roy's the type to do something stupid when he's been drinking, and he's been drinking a lot lately." After Tom had ridden off, Lydia and Ezra had stood on the porch in silence. Finally, she'd said, "I meant what I told Tom. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid. Whatever happens, I'm facing it here." "Even if it means Roy comes with the law?" "Even then." She'd turned to look at him, and in her eyes he'd seen the woman who'd crawled through a blizzard to survive, who'd shot the hat off a hired thug, who'd stood up to a self-righteous reverend. "I've spent my whole life letting other people make choices for me. My stepfather chose who I'd marry. Roy chose how I'd live. Even my mother chose to give up rather than fight. I'm done with that. This is my choice, Ezra. I'm choosing to stay. I'm choosing to fight. And I'm choosing not to let fear rule my life anymore." Ezra had felt something shift in his chest, admiration, respect, and something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. "Then we'll face it together, whatever comes." "Together," she'd echoed, and somehow that single word had carried more weight than any marriage vow. The confrontation came 1 week later, on a Sunday morning when most decent people were in church. Ezra had been outside splitting firewood. Even in spring they'd need fuel for cooking when he'd heard the wagon. He'd set down the axe and walked around to the front of the cabin, Lydia emerging to stand beside him. There were 2 wagons. In the first sat Reverend Blackwood, his face set in righteous disapproval. In the second sat Roy Anderson, and Ezra got his first good look at the man who'd nearly killed Lydia. Roy was thin and mean-looking, with the bloated face and red-veined nose of a heavy drinker. He was dressed in clothes that had once been nice but were now stained and rumpled, and even from a distance Ezra could smell the whiskey on him. Beside Roy sat a man in a suit, a lawyer, from the looks of him, clutching a leather satchel. "Mr. Collins, Miss Hartwell." Blackwood climbed down from his wagon, his voice formal and cold. "I've brought Mr. Anderson and his legal representative, Mr. Pemberton. They have matters to discuss with you." Roy had climbed down from his wagon, unsteady on his feet, his eyes fixed on Lydia with an expression that made Ezra's hands clench into fists. "There she is, my darling wife. Come to take you home, Lydia." Lydia had stood her ground, though Ezra could feel her trembling beside him. "I'm not your wife, Roy. I never was." "The law says different." The lawyer, Pemberton, had stepped forward, pulling papers from his satchel. "I have here documentation showing that Mr. Anderson paid for your passage from Nebraska to Wyoming with the express purpose of marriage. Under territorial common law, this constitutes a valid marriage contract." "There was no ceremony," Lydia had said, her voice stronger now. "No preacher, no witnesses, no vows exchanged. Common law marriage doesn't require those formalities. The contract of passage, your residence in his home, your cohabitation, all of these establish legal marriage." Pemberton had adjusted his spectacles. "Furthermore, Mr. Anderson has filed a complaint with Sheriff Thompson, stating that you abandoned your marital home and that Mr. Collins has been harboring you illegally. The sheriff has asked me to resolve this matter before it becomes necessary to involve the law officially." "Let him involve the law," Ezra had said, "because I'll tell any judge who'll listen what really happened. How Roy beat her, how he threw her out to die in a blizzard, how she nearly froze to death because of his cruelty." Roy had sneered. "She'll say anything to avoid her wifely duties. She's a liar and a whore. Probably spread her legs for you the first night she was here." Ezra had moved before he'd fully registered the decision, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. His fist had connected with Roy's jaw with a satisfying crack, sending the man sprawling in the dirt. "Ezra, don't!" Lydia had called out, but he'd barely heard her. Roy had scrambled backward, his hand going to his belt where a knife was sheathed, but Ezra had been faster, pinning Roy's arm and leaning in close enough to smell the rot on his breath. "You say one more word about her, make one more accusation, and I'll finish what that blizzard started," Ezra had growled. "You're a coward and a bully, and the only reason you're still breathing is because she doesn't want your death on her conscience." "Mr. Collins, that's assault," Pemberton had spluttered. "Reverend, you're a witness." "I saw Mr. Anderson speak in a grossly inappropriate manner about a lady, and Mr. Collins defend her honor," Blackwood had said stiffly. And despite his disapproval of their living situation, there had been something in his eyes that suggested even he had limits to what he'd tolerate. "If Mr. Anderson wishes to press charges, he's welcome to explain to the sheriff exactly what words provoked the response." Ezra had released Roy, who'd scrambled to his feet, spitting blood. "This isn't over. She's my wife by law, and I'm taking her back." "No." Lydia had stepped forward, her chin raised. "You're not. And if the law says I have to go with you, then the law is wrong. I'd rather hang for murder than go back to that shack." "You don't get a choice," Roy had shouted. "I paid for you. You're mine. I'm nobody's." The words had ripped from Lydia's throat, years of pain and anger finally breaking free. "I'm not property. I'm not a thing to be bought and sold. I'm a human being and I have rights." "The law," Pemberton had started. "To hell with the law." Lydia had advanced on them, and all 3 men had taken an involuntary step back from the fury in her eyes. What kind of law says a man can beat his wife? What kind of law says attempted murder is legal as long as you're married? What kind of law puts property rights over human life? She'd been magnificent in her rage, and Ezra had felt his heart swell with something that might have been love, or might have been simple admiration for her courage. "Roy Anderson never married me," Lydia had continued, her voice ringing across the homestead. "He purchased my passage, yes, but a train ticket isn't a wedding vow. He dragged me to his shack, he raped me, he beat me, and when I displeased him, he threw me out to die. Those aren't the actions of a husband. Those are the actions of a criminal. And if your law can't see the difference, Then your law is as corrupt as he is. There had been a long, frozen moment. Even Roy had seemed shocked into silence by her words. Then Reverend Blackwood had cleared his throat. "Mr. Pemberton, might I have a word?" The two men had walked a short distance away, speaking in low tones. Roy had glared at Lydia and Ezra but kept his distance, apparently having learned his lesson about provoking Ezra's fists. Finally, Blackwood and Pemberton had returned. The lawyer had looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Miss Hartwell," Pemberton had said carefully, "in light of your testimony regarding the conditions of your stay with Mr. Anderson, and given the lack of formal ceremony, I believe this matter is more complex than initially presented. I will need to consult with Sheriff Thompson and possibly a territorial judge before any legal action can be taken." "What?" Roy had exploded. "You said you could get her back. I paid you good money." "You paid me to review the legal situation, which I have done. The situation is complicated by allegations of severe mistreatment. If Miss Hartwell's claims are true, and given her injuries they appear credible, then any marriage contract could be considered void due to duress and abuse." "She's lying. She's making it all up." "Is she?" Blackwood had asked quietly. "Because I can see the scars on her face from here. I saw them when I visited last month, fresh bruises that told their own story. If you're claiming she's lying, Mr. Anderson, then perhaps you should explain how she came by those injuries." Roy had opened his mouth, then closed it, unable to find words that wouldn't incriminate him. "I thought as much." Blackwood had turned to Lydia, and there had been something almost like respect in his eyes. "Miss Hartwell, I still believe your living situation here is improper, but I also believe that no woman should be forced to return to a man who has harmed her. I will speak with Sheriff Thompson myself and make clear that any attempt to force your return should be carefully considered." It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall of judgment, a small acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, there were things more important than propriety. Roy had climbed back into his wagon, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," he'd snarled. "I'll be back, and next time I won't bother with lawyers and preachers." "Then next time, you'd better bring a coffin," Ezra had said quietly, "because that's what you'll need." The two wagons had pulled away, disappearing down the road. Ezra and Lydia had stood watching until they were out of sight, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "Do you think he'll come back?" Lydia had asked finally. "Yes. Men like Roy don't let go easily. He'll come back and he'll bring trouble with him. Then we'll be ready." She'd turned to him, and there had been steel in her eyes. "I meant what I said, Ezra. I'm not going back. I'd rather die than go back." "It won't come to that." "How can you be sure?" He'd looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the broken woman he'd found in the snow, but the fighter she'd become. "Because I won't let it. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, I won't let him take you." She'd studied his face, searching for something. Then, slowly, she'd reached out and taken his hand. "Why? Why are you doing this? Why risk everything for me?" It was a question Ezra had been avoiding asking himself because he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. But standing there with her hand in his, with the afternoon sun warm on their faces and the future uncertain before them, he found the words. "Because you deserve better. Because everyone deserves a chance to choose their own life. And because—" He'd paused, then finished quietly. "Because somewhere along the way, your fight became my fight. Your future became important to me. And I'm not willing to let it be stolen by a drunk with a piece of paper that says he owns you." Tears had welled in Lydia's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. "Thank you," she'd whispered, "for seeing me as a person, not property, for believing I'm worth fighting for. I don't know how to repay that." "You don't need to repay it. That's what I've been trying to tell you. This isn't a transaction. It's just what's right." They'd stood there, hands clasped, the weight of unspoken feelings heavy between them. It still wasn't love. Both of them were too damaged for that simple word to capture the complexity of what they felt. But it was partnership. It was loyalty. It was two people who'd found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. That night, as they sat by the fire, Lydia mending socks, Ezra cleaning his rifle, she'd said suddenly, "If I stay, if I really make this my home, people will never accept it. The gossip will never stop." "Probably not," It'll hurt your reputation, your business, your standing in the community. I've lived without those things for 5 years. I think I can manage. She'd set down her mending, looking at him seriously. But what about the future? What if you want to remarry someday? Having me here, having people think that there's something improper, it'll make that impossible. Ezra had been quiet for a long moment, running the cleaning rod through the rifle barrel. Finally, he'd said, I buried my heart with Sarah. I didn't think I'd ever want to open it again, but these past months, having you here, it's reminded me what it feels like to have someone to care about, someone to protect, someone to just be with. He'd looked up, meeting her eyes. I'm not saying I'm ready for anything. I'm not sure I ever will be, but having you here doesn't feel like an obstacle to some future I might want. It feels like the future I've got, and that's enough. Lydia had been crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. How are you real? How does someone like you exist in a world with men like Roy and Silas? Same way someone like you exists. We survive the darkness and try to remember what light looks like. He'd set down the rifle, his voice gentle. You don't owe me anything, Lydia. Not gratitude, not obligation, nothing. If you stay, it's because you choose to. If you leave, I'll help you go. But whatever you decide, it's your choice, your life, your future. She'd wiped her eyes, then picked up her mending again, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar motions. I choose to stay, she'd said quietly. Not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I owe you, but because this... She'd gestured around the cabin at the life they'd built together. This feels like home. For the first time since my mother died, I feel like I belong somewhere, like I matter. You do matter. I know, because you've shown me that every single day. She'd looked at him, and in her eyes was a warmth that made his heart ache. So I'm staying, I'm planting that garden, and I'm going to harvest it come summer. I'm going to make curtains for these windows and quilts for that bed. I'm going to turn this cabin into a real home. And if people want to gossip, let them. I've survived worse than gossip. Ezra had felt something loosen in his chest, some tension he hadn't known he was carrying. She was staying, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because she'd chosen him, chosen this life, chosen to stop running and start fighting. Then let's make it official, he'd said. Not marriage. Neither of us is ready for that. And with Roy's claim hanging over us, it'd be complicated anyway. But a partnership. You're not a guest anymore, Lydia. You're a partner in this homestead. Equal share in everything. The work, the decisions, the future. Whatever we build here, we build it together. She'd stared at him, stunned. Ezra, I can't accept that. It's your land, your home. It's our home. If you're staying, if you're putting down roots here, then you deserve to have a real stake in it. Not as a hired hand or a guest, but as a full partner. He'd extended his hand. What do you say? Partners? Lydia had looked at his hand, then at his face, then back at his hand. Then she'd reached out and clasped it firmly. Partners. They'd shaken on it, and somehow that handshake meant more than any wedding vow either of them had ever spoken. It was a commitment born not of law or tradition or social expectation, but of mutual respect and shared struggle. It was two broken people deciding to build something whole. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched vast and star-filled above them. Somewhere in the darkness, Roy Anderson was nursing his wounds and plotting his revenge. Somewhere, the town of Bitter Creek was buzzing with gossip about the improper woman and the widower who'd taken her in. Somewhere, the world continued to turn, indifferent to their small drama. But inside the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, Ezra and Lydia sat in companionable silence, partners in survival, and for the first time in a very long time, both of them felt something that might have been happiness. It was fragile, tentative, and threatened from all sides. But it was real. And sometimes real is all you need to build a life worth living. Spring deepened into early summer, and the partnership between Ezra and Lydia flourished like Lydia's carefully tended garden. The beans she'd planted in March were climbing their poles, green and vigorous. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, promising a harvest that would see them through the next winter. Lettuce and radishes had already been picked and eaten, their fresh taste a luxury after months of dried and preserved foods. The homestead itself had transformed under Lydia's touch. The curtains she'd made, simple but clean, softened the cabin's interior. She'd sewn cushions for the chairs from fabric scraps, making the hard wooden seats more comfortable. The garden had expanded from a small plot to a sprawling enterprise, with rows of corn, squash, and potatoes joining the earlier plantings. She'd even started a small herb garden near the kitchen window, and the smell of basil and thyme drifted through the cabin when she cooked. Ezra had built her a chicken coop worthy of the name, replacing the ramshackle structure that had barely kept the foxes out. Together, they'd repaired the barn, replacing rotted boards and reinforcing the roof. They'd purchased 3 more cows from Tom Miller, expanding Ezra's small herd. The work was hard and endless, but there was satisfaction in it. The satisfaction of building something, of making the land yield to careful tending and patient labor. They'd fallen into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Ezra would wake before dawn, start the fire, and make coffee while Lydia dressed behind her screen. They'd have breakfast together, usually eggs and bread, sometimes bacon if they'd recently slaughtered, and plan the day's work. Then they'd separate to their tasks, coming together for the midday meal, then parting again until evening. The evenings were Ezra's favorite time. They'd sit on the porch if the weather was fine, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Lydia would tell him stories from books she'd read, or sing songs her mother had taught her. Her voice was beautiful, clear and sweet, and Ezra found himself looking forward to those songs like a man looks forward to water in the desert. Sometimes they'd play chess on the board Tom Miller had given them. Lydia was getting better, her strategy improving with each game, and she'd beaten Ezra twice now, victories she'd celebrated with uncharacteristic exuberance that had made him laugh. It was during one of these peaceful evenings, as they sat on the porch shelling peas for dinner, that Lydia had asked about Sarah. "You don't have to talk about her if you don't want to," she'd said carefully, "but I'd like to know about her, about the woman who made this place a home before I came." Ezra had been quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing their work automatically. It still hurt to talk about Sarah, but the pain had dulled from a sharp stab to a gentle ache. Grief remembered, rather than grief lived. "She was strong," he'd finally said. "Not in the way you think of strength. She wasn't tall or particularly robust. But she had this inner strength, this certainty about who she was and what she believed. Nothing could shake her." "How did you meet?" "In Ohio, before we came west. Her father owned the farm next to my family's. We grew up together, really. I can't remember a time when I didn't know her." A small smile had crossed his face at the memory. "She was always getting into trouble as a girl. Climbing trees she had no business climbing, racing horses she shouldn't have been riding. Her mother despaired of ever making a lady out of her. She sounds wonderful." She was. When the war came, I enlisted. She waited for me, even though everyone told her she was foolish to wait for a man who might never come back. But she did. And when I came home, changed, damaged, she married me anyway. "The war changed you?" "Changed everyone who went through it. I saw things, did things. Things I can't talk about even now. Sarah never pushed me to talk about it. She just loved me through it, reminded me who I was before the war tried to take that away." His hands had stilled on the peas. "After we married, we decided to come west. Start fresh, build something of our own. We homesteaded here, spent 5 years turning this raw land into something productive. Those were good years. Hard, but good. And then she got sick. Started with a lump in her breast. She didn't tell me right away, didn't want to worry me. By the time she did, it was too late. The doctor said there was nothing to be done but keep her comfortable." His voice had roughened. "I watched her fade for 6 months. Watched her hurt, watched her body betray her. And there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it." Lydia had set down her bowl of peas and reached over, taking his hand. "I'm sorry. That must have been unbearable." "The worst part was after. When she was gone and the house was so quiet, I thought I'd go mad from it. I kept expecting to hear her voice, to see her coming through the door. For months, I'd wake up and reach for her, forgetting for just a moment that she wasn't there anymore." He'd looked at Lydia, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I shut down after that. Stopped living, really, just existed. Went through the motions because I didn't know what else to do. And then? And then I found a half-frozen woman in the snow, and life decided I wasn't done yet. He'd squeezed her hand. You saved me too, you know. Maybe not from dying, but from the slow death of loneliness, from forgetting what it meant to have someone to care about. Lydia's eyes had filled with tears. Do you think she'd approve of me being here? Ezra had considered the question seriously. Yes. Sarah always believed in helping people. She took in strays, animals, people. Didn't matter. If someone needed help, she gave it, and she wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone, mourning her. She'd want me to live. He'd smiled slightly. She'd probably have some choice words about how long it took me to figure that out. They'd sat in comfortable silence after that, the evening shadows lengthening across the land. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The land was settling into its summer rhythms, and so were they. But peace, as Ezra had learned, was always temporary on the frontier. The trouble came on a Saturday in late June, when the heat hung heavy and still over the plains. Ezra had been working on the south pasture fence, replacing a section that the cattle had damaged, when he'd heard the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. His heart had immediately begun to race. Multiple riders moving at speed rarely meant anything good. He'd dropped his tools and run for the cabin, shouting for Lydia. She'd appeared in the doorway, the Winchester already in her hands. How many? Couldn't tell. 5 or 6, maybe. He'd grabbed his rifle from inside the door. Stay inside. Don't come out unless I call for you. Like hell. We're partners, remember? She'd taken up position by the window, the rifle barrel resting on the sill. I'm not hiding while you face whatever's coming. There'd been no time to argue. The riders had crested the small rise to the east, and Ezra had counted 6 men on horseback. Roy Anderson was at the front, and even from a distance, Ezra could see he was drunk, swaying in the saddle, his face red with rage or whiskey, or both. Behind Roy were 5 other men, and Ezra's heart had sunk as he recognized several of them. Carter was there, the saloon worker who'd come before. But there were also 2 men he recognized from around Bitter Creek, drifters, the kind who do anything for money. And bringing up the rear were 2 men Ezra didn't know, hard-faced and heavily armed, with the look of professional gunmen. This wasn't a legal delegation or an attempt at negotiation. This was a lynch mob. Ezra Collins, Roy had shouted as they'd pulled up about 30 yards from the cabin. Send out my wife. Send her out now, and maybe we'll let you live. Ezra had stepped off the porch, his rifle held loosely but ready. Go home, Roy. You're drunk and making a fool of yourself. I'm taking back what's mine. She's my wife, bought and paid for, and I'm not leaving without her. She's not property, and she's not going anywhere with you. One of the gunmen had leaned forward in his saddle. We can do this easy or hard, Collins. Either way, we're taking the woman. Question is whether you're still breathing when we leave. There's 6 of you and 1 of me, Ezra had said, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. Odds are you'll win, but I guarantee at least 3 of you won't make it home. So you'd better ask yourselves, is Roy paying you enough to die for him? Carter had shifted uncomfortably. Look, Collins, we don't want anyone to get hurt. Just hand over the woman. Her name is Lydia. The shout had come from the cabin, and Lydia had appeared in the doorway, the rifle raised to her shoulder. Stop calling me the woman, like I'm a piece of livestock. I'm Lydia Hartwell, and I'm not going anywhere with Roy Anderson. You don't get a say, bitch, Roy had snarled. You're my wife. The law says you belong to me. Then the law is wrong, Lydia's voice had rung out clear and strong. And I'll die before I go back to you. That can be arranged. Roy had reached for his pistol, his movements clumsy with drink. Everything had happened at once. Ezra had brought his rifle up, sighting on Roy. Lydia had done the same. The 6 men had started to draw their weapons. For a frozen instant, everyone had been pointing guns at everyone else, a tableau of violence waiting to explode. Then a new voice had cut through the tension. Everyone put down your weapons. Now! A 7th rider had come around the side of the cabin, Sheriff Thompson, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Behind him came Tom Miller and 2 of his ranch hands, all armed. I said put them down, Thompson had barked. Next man who moves gets buckshot. Slowly, reluctantly, weapons had been lowered. Roy had been the last to comply, his face twisted with fury. "What the hell is this, Sheriff?" he'd demanded. "I'm here to claim my legal property." "You're here leading what looks like a lynch mob," Thompson had replied coldly. "And I'll be damned if I allow vigilante justice in my territory." "She's my wife! I got papers that say—" "Papers I haven't seen. Papers that Miss Hartwell disputes the validity of. And until a judge rules on this matter, nobody's taking anybody anywhere by force." Thompson had ridden forward, positioning himself between the two groups. "Now, I'm going to give you boys a choice. You can ride back to town peacefully. We'll schedule a proper hearing before Judge Morrison next week, and we'll let the law sort this out. Or you can try to force the issue, and I'll arrest every last one of you for attempted assault." "You can't arrest all of us," one of the gunmen had said. "Maybe not, but I'll start with you, and I don't miss at this range." Thompson's voice had been flat, deadly serious. "Test me if you want. See how it works out." For a long moment, no one had moved. Then Roy had spat in the dirt. "Fine. We'll do it legal. But when the judge rules in my favor, and he will, I'm taking her back. And Collins, when she's back where she belongs, I'm going to make you pay for every day you kept her from me." "Looking forward to it," Ezra had said quietly. Roy and his men had turned their horses and ridden off, though Roy had kept looking back, his eyes full of murder. When they were out of sight, Thompson had lowered his shotgun and let out a long breath. "That was close," he'd said. "Another few seconds, and this would have turned into a bloodbath." "How did you know to come?" Ezra had asked, lowering his own rifle. "Tom sent his boy riding for me this morning, said he'd heard Roy was gathering men and liquoring up his courage." Thompson had glanced at Tom, who dismounted and was checking his horse. "I got here as fast as I could." Tom had walked over to Ezra, his face serious. "I told you Roy was the type to do something stupid. When I heard he was recruiting guns in the saloon, I knew he was planning something." Lydia had stepped off the porch, the Winchester still in her hands but pointed safely at the ground. "Thank you, both of you. If you hadn't come, don't think about what might have happened. Think about what comes next." Thompson had turned to her, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Miss Hartwell, this is going to trial. Judge Morrison will be in Bitter Creek next Friday. You'll need to make your case before him, explain why you believe the marriage isn't valid, present evidence of Roy's mistreatment, convince the judge that you shouldn't be forced to return. And if I can't convince him?" Thompson had been silent for a moment. "Then legally, you'd be considered Roy's wife, and he'd have the right to take you back. I couldn't stop him, much as I might want to." Lydia had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "Then I'd better make a convincing case. You'll need witnesses, people who can testify to Roy's character, to the state you were in when Collins found you, to the circumstances of your arrival in Wyoming." Thompson had looked at Ezra. "You'll be her primary witness. Tom, I'd appreciate if you'd testify too, as a character witness for both Collins and Miss Hartwell." "Of course," Tom had said immediately. "What about Reverend Blackwood?" Lydia had asked. "He saw my injuries when he visited in February. Would his testimony help?" "It might, though I'm not sure he'll be willing to testify on your behalf, given his views on your living situation." Thompson had climbed back on his horse. "You've got a week to prepare. Use it well. And Collins, keep your guns close and your eyes open. Roy's drunk and humiliated, and that's a dangerous combination. He might try something before the trial." After Thompson and Tom had left, Ezra and Lydia had gone back inside the cabin. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving them both shaky and exhausted. Lydia had set the Winchester carefully in the corner and collapsed into a chair. "A trial," she'd said quietly. "My whole future decided by a judge who doesn't know me, based on laws I don't understand." Ezra had poured her a cup of water from the bucket, pressing it into her hands. "We'll make them understand. We'll tell them everything. What Roy did, how you survived, why you can't go back. And if they don't believe me, if they decide a train ticket equals a marriage contract, that Roy's rights as a husband supersede my rights as a human being, then we'll figure something else out." "Like what? Running? Leaving everything behind and hoping Roy doesn't follow?" She'd shaken her head. "I'm so tired of running, Ezra. So tired of being afraid. He'd knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. Then we won't run. We'll fight this in court, and we'll win. But Lydia, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that the law might not be on our side. These judges, they're old men with old ideas about marriage and property and a woman's place. They might not see things the way we do. So what do we do if we lose? Ezra had been quiet for a long moment, wrestling with a decision he'd been avoiding. Finally, he'd said, "If we lose, if the judge rules you have to go back to Roy, then there's one option left." "What option?" "You marry me. For real, legal marriage. A man can't claim another man's wife, no matter what papers he's got. If you're legally married to me, Roy's claim becomes invalid." Lydia had stared at him, her eyes wide. "Ezra, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering." He'd squeezed her hands. "It wouldn't have to mean anything changes between us. It'd be a legal protection, nothing more. We'd still be partners, still live the way we've been living, but you'd be safe. Roy couldn't touch you. That's not fair to you. You'd be trapped in a marriage you don't want, tied to me for the rest of your life. Who says I don't want it?" The words had come out before Ezra could stop them, and in the silence that followed, he had realized they were true. Somewhere along the way, without quite noticing when it happened, his feelings for Lydia had deepened into something more than partnership, more than friendship. Not the passionate love he'd shared with Sarah. That belonged to his youth, to a different life, but something quieter, steadier, something that felt like coming home. Lydia's eyes had filled with tears. "Ezra, I'm not saying I'm in love with you," he'd said quickly, though even as he said it, he wondered if it was true. "I'm not asking for a real marriage, not in the way most people mean it. But I care about you. I care about your safety, your happiness, your future. And if marrying you keeps you safe from Roy Anderson, then I'll do it gladly. But what about what you want? What about your future? My future is here, on this land, doing this work. Whether I do it alone or with a partner doesn't change the work. But having you here, having someone to talk to share meals with, to sit with in the evenings, that's made me happier than I've been in 5 years. So maybe this is what I want. Maybe I just didn't realize it until now." Lydia had pulled her hands free and stood, walking to the window. She'd stared out at the land she'd come to love, the garden she'd planted, the life she'd helped build. When she'd finally spoken, her voice had been barely a whisper. "When I was on that train west, heading toward a husband I'd never met, I remember thinking that marriage was just another form of slavery, a transaction where men bought women and expected obedience in return. I swore to myself that if I ever got free, I'd never marry again. I'd never put myself under a man's power like that." "Lydia, but you've shown me something different. You've shown me that partnership can exist between a man and a woman, that respect and equality are possible, that marriage doesn't have to be about power and ownership." She'd turned back to face him, tears streaming down her face. "So yes, if it comes to that, if we lose the trial, and it's the only way to keep me safe, I'll marry you. But not just as a legal protection. I'll marry you because I trust you, because you've given me back my life when I thought it was over, because being here with you is the first time I've felt truly safe since my mother died." Ezra had stood, closing the distance between them. "Then that's settled. We'll fight the trial with everything we've got. But if we lose, we have a backup plan. Either way, Roy Anderson isn't getting you back." She'd nodded, wiping her eyes. "Either way." They'd sealed the agreement with a handshake, formal, slightly awkward, but somehow perfect for what they were. A partnership strengthened, a commitment deepened. Not romance exactly, but something just as valuable. Something built on respect and trust rather than passion and poetry. The next week had been a blur of preparation. Tom Miller had helped them find a lawyer, a young man named Samuel Finch, fresh from Denver, who was trying to build a practice in the territory. Finch had listened to Lydia's story with growing outrage, taking careful notes, asking pointed questions about dates and witnesses and evidence. The challenge, Finch had explained, is that territorial law on common law marriage is vague and inconsistent. Some judges recognize it, some don't. Judge Morrison tends to be conservative. He believes in traditional marriage and a husband's authority over his wife, but he's also fair. If we can show that Roy's behavior was criminal, that the marriage was never valid to begin with, we have a chance. What kind of chance? Lydia had asked. Finch had hesitated. Honestly, maybe 50-50. Morrison doesn't like women who defy social conventions. He'll see your living situation with Mr. Collins as evidence of moral failing. But he also doesn't tolerate violence against women. If we can make the case that Roy attempted to murder you, that might tip the scales. So our strategy is what? We established that there was no valid marriage, no ceremony, no witnesses, no mutual consent. We proved that Roy's payment for your passage was not a marriage contract, but simply transportation. We document his abuse and the attempt on your life. And we present you as a respectable woman who was victimized by a violent criminal, not a wayward wife who abandoned her husband. It had sounded good in theory, but as the trial date approached, Lydia's anxiety had grown. She'd wake from nightmares of being dragged back to Roy's shack, of Ezra being powerless to stop it, of losing everything she'd built. Ezra had done his best to comfort her, but he was fighting his own fears. What if the law sided with Roy? What if marriage to him wasn't enough to protect her? What if Roy decided to take matters into his own hands before the trial even happened? The night before the trial, neither of them had slept much. They'd sat up by the fire, drinking coffee and not talking, each lost in their own thoughts. As dawn broke, Lydia had finally spoken. Whatever happens today, I want you to know something. What's that? These past months here, building this life with you, they've been the happiest of my life. Even with Roy threatening us, even with the uncertainty and the fear, I've been happy. Because for the first time, I've had a choice. I've had agency. I've been treated like a person, not property. She'd looked at him, her eyes serious. If the judge rules against me today, if I have to go back to Roy, I need you to promise me something. Anything. But don't try to stop them from taking me. Don't get yourself killed fighting a battle we can't win. Just let me go. Remember me as I am now, not as whatever Roy makes me become. Lydia, I can't. Promise me, Ezra. Please. You've given me so much. The last thing I want is for you to die because of me. Ezra had wanted to argue, to tell her that he'd fight to his last breath to protect her. But looking into her eyes, seeing the fierce determination there, he'd understood. She needed to know that whatever happened, his death wouldn't be on her conscience. She needed to be free of that burden. I promise, he'd lied, knowing even as he said it that he'd break that promise if he had to. But it seemed to give her peace, and that was worth the lie. They'd ridden into Bitter Creek as the sun climbed higher, Tom Miller accompanying them for moral support. The town had seemed different somehow, hostile, judgmental. People had stopped their conversations to stare as they'd passed. Some had whispered behind their hands. A few had called out insults, questioning Lydia's virtue and Ezra's honor. The courthouse was a simple wooden building that also served as the town hall, and when needed, a church. Judge Morrison had set up his bench at the front of the room, and townspeople had filed in to watch the proceedings. It seemed like half of Bitter Creek had turned out, eager for the spectacle. Roy had been there, flanked by Pemberton and two of the men who'd ridden with him the week before. He'd looked smug, confident, like a man who already knew he'd won. When he'd seen Lydia, he'd smiled, a cruel, possessive smile that had made Ezra's hands clench into fists. Judge Morrison had been a stern-faced man in his 60s, with gray hair and eyes that seemed to weigh and judge everything they saw. He'd called the court to order and listened as Pemberton had presented Roy's case. Your Honor, the facts are simple. Mr. Anderson paid for Miss Hartwell's passage from Nebraska to Wyoming, with the express purpose of marriage. She came west, lived in his home as his wife, shared his bed. Under territorial common law statutes, this constitutes a valid marriage. Miss Hartwell then abandoned her husband without cause and has been living in adultery with Mr. Collins. We ask that you order her return to her lawful husband and consider charges against Mr. Collins for harboring another man's wife. Then it had been Finch's turn. He'd stood, young and earnest, and presented Lydia's side. Your Honor, there was no marriage, no ceremony, no witnesses, no exchange of vows. Mr. Anderson paid for transportation, not a wife. Upon Miss Hartwell's arrival, he subjected her to physical and sexual violence. He beat her regularly, threatened her life, and ultimately threw her out into a blizzard to die. She survived only by chance when Mr. Collins found her nearly frozen to death. This isn't a case of a wayward wife, it's a case of a woman escaping from an attempted murderer. Morrison had listened to both sides, his face impassive. Then he'd called witnesses. Roy had testified first, painting a picture of himself as a wronged husband whose wife had been seduced away by a scheming neighbor. He'd claimed Lydia had been happy until Collins had poisoned her mind against him. He had denied the abuse, calling it normal marital discipline and claiming Lydia's injuries were from a fall, not a beating. Then Lydia had taken the stand. She'd been terrified. Ezra could see her hands shaking, see the way she gripped the edge of the witness box. But when she'd started speaking, her voice had been clear and strong. She told her story from the beginning, the forced marriage arrangement, the train west, meeting Roy, the shack that was supposed to be a ranch, the rape on her first night, the escalating violence, the night he'd beaten her over the locket and thrown her out to die. I crawled through that blizzard for hours, she'd said, and her voice had broken slightly. I couldn't feel my hands or my feet. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I knew I was dying, but I kept crawling because I refused to let him win. I refused to die in the snow like worthless trash. And Mr. Collins, Morrison had asked, how did you come to be living with him? He found me by his fence line the next morning, half buried in snow. He saved my life, brought me inside, warmed me, fed me, asked nothing in return. He gave me a safe place to heal, both my body and my spirit. He's treated me with more respect and kindness in these few months than Roy Anderson showed me in a single day. Yet you've been living with him, unchaperoned, in a situation most would consider improper. I've been living as his partner and friend, nothing more. We share work, share meals, share a life, but there's been nothing improper between us. Mr. Collins is a gentleman in the truest sense of the word. He's protected me, respected me, and given me the freedom to make my own choices. Morrison had made notes, his expression unreadable. Then Ezra had been called to testify. He'd confirmed Lydia's story, described finding her in the snow, detailed the extent of her injuries. He'd been careful to emphasize that their relationship had been entirely proper, that Lydia had her own sleeping area, that they lived as friends and partners, nothing more. And yet you're willing to harbor a woman who may legally be another man's wife, Morrison had asked. I'm willing to protect a woman from a man who tried to kill her, Ezra had replied. If that makes me a criminal, then I'll accept whatever punishment you see fit, but I won't apologize for saving her life. Tom Miller had testified to both Ezra's and Lydia's character. Even Reverend Blackwood had taken the stand, reluctantly admitting that while he disapproved of their living arrangement, he'd seen evidence of Roy's abuse and believed Lydia's account. Finally, it had been Roy's turn for cross-examination. Finch had been merciless, catching Roy in lie after lie, forcing him to admit he had no witnesses to any marriage ceremony, no documentation beyond the payment for Lydia's ticket, no evidence that she'd ever consented to be his wife. So you paid for her passage, dragged her to your shack, raped her, beat her, and threw her out to die. And you expect this court to call that marriage? Finch had demanded. She's my wife, Roy had shouted, his face red. She belonged to me. She's not a horse or a piece of furniture, Mr. Anderson. She's a human being, and human beings can't be owned. The trial had lasted all day. By the time closing arguments had been made, the sun was setting, and everyone in the courthouse was exhausted. Morrison had declared he'd render his verdict the following morning, and court had been adjourned. That night, Ezra and Lydia had stayed at Tom Miller's house, neither willing to risk the ride back to the homestead in the dark. They'd barely spoken, both too anxious about the coming verdict. Lydia had finally broken the silence around midnight. They'd been sitting in Tom's parlor, unable to sleep, when she'd said quietly, "If he rules against me, if I have to go back, I want you to know. I'll find a way out. I'll run, or I'll fight, or I'll do whatever I have to do. But I won't live under Roy's control again. You won't have to. If Morrison rules against you, we'll get married before they can take you. It'll be done before Roy can stop it. And if that doesn't work," Ezra had met her eyes, "then I'll break my promise to you. I'll fight. And if I have to, I'll put Roy Anderson in the ground before I let him take you." She'd started to cry then, quiet, desperate tears. And Ezra had done something he'd never done before. He'd pulled her into his arms and held her while she wept, her body shaking against his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. "It's going to be all right," he'd murmured into her hair. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I promise you, Lydia, you're not alone anymore." And sitting there in the darkness, holding this woman who'd come to mean so much to him, Ezra had realized the full truth of his feelings. He loved her, not the same way he'd loved Sarah. That had been the bright, passionate love of youth. This was different, quieter, deeper, the love of two wounded souls who'd found healing in each other's company. He didn't say the words aloud. The timing was wrong, and he wasn't sure she was ready to hear them. But he felt them settling into his bones, becoming part of who he was. Whatever the judge decided tomorrow, whatever trials lay ahead, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would protect Lydia Hartwell with his last breath. She was his partner, his friend, and whether she knew it or not, she'd become his reason for living again. The storm was coming. Roy Anderson would return with violence in his heart. The law might side against them. The whole world might try to tear them apart, but they would face it together. And somehow, some way, they would survive. They had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Ezra and Lydia had managed perhaps an hour of restless sleep before dawn pulled them back into the waking world. They dressed in silence, the weight of the coming verdict pressing down on them like a physical thing. Tom's wife had made breakfast, but neither of them could eat more than a few bites. The walk to the courthouse felt like a march to the gallows. The street was already crowded with townspeople, all eager to hear Judge Morrison's decision. Some faces showed sympathy, but most were merely curious, treating the whole affair as entertainment. Lydia had held her head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick and stifling despite the early hour. Roy was already there, looking haggard but confident. He'd caught Lydia's eye and smiled that cruel smile again, and she'd felt her stomach turn over. Morrison had entered exactly at 9 o'clock, his black robes lending him an air of absolute authority. Everyone had stood until he'd taken his seat, then sat in a rustle of fabric and creaking wood. "I've considered the evidence and testimony presented yesterday," Morrison had begun, his voice carrying through the silent room. "This is a complex case involving questions of common law marriage, personal liberty, and the rights of husbands versus the rights of women. The law in these matters is not always clear, and reasonable people may disagree on its application." Ezra had felt Lydia's hand find his under the table, her fingers cold and trembling. He'd squeezed gently, trying to give her strength even as his own heart hammered in his chest. "Mr. Anderson claims that by paying for Miss Hartwell's passage and cohabiting with her, he established a common law marriage under territorial statute. This claim has some merit. There are precedents for such arrangements being recognized as legally binding." Roy had leaned forward, his expression triumphant. Pemberton had actually smiled. "However," Morrison had continued, and that single word had changed the entire atmosphere in the room, "common law marriage requires certain elements beyond mere cohabitation. It requires mutual consent, public acknowledgement of the marital relationship, and critically, it cannot be established through force, fraud, or duress." Lydia's grip on Ezra's hand had tightened. "The evidence presented by Miss Hartwell is compelling, and more importantly, largely uncontradicted. Mr. Anderson himself admitted there was no ceremony, no witnesses to any exchange of vows, and no mutual agreement to be married. He paid for transportation and expected compliance. That is not marriage. That is human trafficking. Your Honor, I object." Pemberton had started to rise, but Morrison had cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Furthermore, the evidence of physical abuse is overwhelming. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing Miss Hartwell's injuries. Reverend Blackwood confirmed the severity of her condition when he visited Mr. Collins's property, and Mr. Anderson's own testimony revealed a disturbing attitude toward women as property rather than people." Morrison had looked directly at Roy, his eyes cold. "A man who beats a woman, who throws her out into a deadly storm, who treats her as chattel to be owned rather than a human being to be cherished, such a man has no claim to the protections of marriage law." The courtroom had erupted in whispers. Roy had gone pale, then red, his hands clenching on the table in front of him. "Therefore, I rule as follows," Morrison had said, his voice rising above the murmurs. "There was no valid marriage between Roy Anderson and Lydia Hartwell. The payment for transportation does not constitute a marriage contract. Miss Hartwell is free and clear of any obligation to Mr. Anderson. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting Mr. Anderson from approaching within 100 yards of Miss Hartwell or Mr. Collins's property. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and imprisonment. Lydia had made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and buried her face in her hands. Ezra had felt a wave of relief so powerful it had left him dizzy. Around them, the courtroom had exploded in noise, some cheering, some protesting, everyone talking at once. "This is an outrage," Roy had shouted, lurching to his feet. "She's mine. I paid for her. You can't—" "Mr. Anderson, sit down and be silent, or I will hold you in contempt." Morrison's voice had cracked like a whip. "You have no claim to this woman. You never did. And if I hear of you harassing her or attempting to circumvent this order, I will see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Do I make myself clear?" Roy had stood there, swaying slightly, his face purple with rage. For a moment, Ezra had thought he might actually attack the judge, but Pemberton had grabbed his arm, pulling him back down, whispering urgently in his ear. "This court is adjourned," Morrison had said, bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack. The crowd had surged forward, some to congratulate Lydia and Ezra, others to commiserate with Roy. Tom Miller had pushed through to grip Ezra's hand. "Congratulations," he'd said, his weathered face split in a wide grin. Justice prevailed after all. Finch had been equally pleased, gathering his papers and promising to file the necessary documentation to make the ruling official. Lydia had thanked him through tears, her voice shaking with emotion and relief. They'd made their way out of the courthouse through a gauntlet of staring townspeople. Some had offered congratulations. Others had whispered behind their hands, their disapproval clear. Lydia had ignored them all, her hand firmly clasped in Ezra's, her spine straight. They'd been halfway to where Tom had left their wagon when the shout had come. "This isn't over!" Ezra had turned to see Roy standing on the courthouse steps, Pemberton trying futilely to restrain him. Roy had shaken off the lawyer's hand, pointing at Lydia with a trembling finger. "You think a judge can protect you? You think a piece of paper means anything out here?" His voice had been thick with drink and rage. "I'll get you back, Lydia. One way or another, you're coming home." Sheriff Thompson had appeared, gripping Roy's arm. "That's a direct violation of the judge's order, Anderson. Keep talking and you'll spend the night in jail." "To hell with you! To hell with all of you!" Roy had wrenched free, stumbling down the steps. "She's mine! Mine!" Thompson had nodded to his deputies, and they'd moved to intercept Roy. But in the confusion, Roy had broken free, running toward where a horse was tied. He'd mounted clumsily, nearly falling, then kicked the animal into a gallop, heading out of town. "Should we go after him?" one of the deputies had asked. Thompson had shaken his head. "Let him go cool off. We'll deal with him if he causes trouble. Right now, let's just make sure everyone else gets home safely." Ezra had felt a chill run down his spine. Roy's threats had been those of a desperate, humiliated man, and desperate men were dangerous. "Sheriff, you really think he's just going to let this go?" "Honestly? No. But legally, my hands are tied until he actually does something." Thompson had looked at Ezra seriously. "Watch your back, Collins. Keep your guns close. And if Roy shows his face on your property, you have the right to defend yourself and Miss Hartwell. The judge's ruling gives you that protection." They'd ridden back to the homestead in the afternoon heat, the sun beating down mercilessly. Lydia had been quiet, staring out at the passing landscape. Finally, she'd spoken. "I should feel relieved. We won. I'm free. But all I feel is afraid. Like this isn't really over." "It might not be," Ezra had admitted. "Roy's not the type to accept defeat gracefully. We need to be prepared." "Prepared for what? For him to come in the night? To burn down the cabin? To ambush us in the fields?" Her voice had risen slightly, the stress of the day finally breaking through. "How do we prepare for a man who has nothing left to lose? We do what we've been doing. We stay alert, we stay armed, and we stay together." He'd reached over, covering her hand with his. "And we trust that we can handle whatever comes." But privately, Ezra had shared her fears. Roy had looked like a man on the edge, pushed past reason by drink and humiliation. And the most dangerous thing in the world was a man with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. They'd reached the homestead as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Everything looked exactly as they'd left it, the cabin solid and welcoming, the garden thriving, the chickens pecking in their yard. It looked like peace. It looked like home. But peace, as Ezra had learned too well, was always fragile on the frontier. That night, they'd eaten a simple dinner and sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Lydia had been quiet, lost in her own thoughts. Finally, she'd said, "Ezra, about your offer, to marry me if we lost the trial. You don't have to worry about that now. We won." "I know, but I want to talk about it anyway." She'd turned to face him, and in the lamplight from the cabin, her face had been serious. "These months living here, building this life with you, they've changed me. When I came here, I was broken. I'd given up on everything, hope, happiness, the possibility of anything good in my future. But you gave all of that back to me." "Lydia, let me finish, please." She'd taken a breath. "I don't want to marry you out of necessity or legal protection. But if you still wanted to, if you thought you could see a future with me as your wife, not just your partner, I want you to know I'd say yes. Not because I have to, because I want to." Ezra's heart had begun to pound. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying I've fallen in love with you, Ezra Collins. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was when you pulled me from the snow. Maybe it was all those quiet evenings on this porch. Maybe it was watching you defend me against Roy and his thugs. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being my rescuer and became my home." He'd stared at her, this woman who'd come into his life like a storm and stayed like sunshine. "I love you too," he'd said, and the words had felt both terrifying and right. "I didn't think I could feel this way again after Sarah. But you're not Sarah. You're something different, something new. And I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just a partnership of convenience." She'd smiled then, genuine and bright. "So ask me." "Ask you what?" "Ask me properly. I've had one man claim me like property. I'd like at least one man to ask me like I'm a person worth choosing." Ezra had stood, then dropped to one knee on the porch. It felt absurd and wonderful at the same time. "Lydia Hartwell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because the law demands it, not because it's convenient, but because I love you and I want to spend whatever time I have left in this world making you happy?" "Yes," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." He'd stood and pulled her into his arms, and they'd kissed for the first time, tentative, gentle, full of promise. It wasn't the passionate kiss of young lovers. It was the kiss of two people who'd been through hell and found each other on the other side. They'd decided to marry quickly, within the week. There was no point in waiting, and besides, making it official would provide an extra layer of legal protection against Roy, should he try anything. Tom and his wife had agreed to stand as witnesses, and even Reverend Blackwood, perhaps softened by the trial's outcome, had agreed to perform the ceremony. The days between the decision and the wedding had passed in a blur of preparation. Lydia had made herself a simple dress from fabric she'd been saving, white muslin with blue trim. She'd looked beautiful in it, and Ezra had told her so repeatedly until she'd laughed and told him to stop. They'd planned to have the ceremony at the cabin, on the porch where they'd spent so many evenings together. It would be small, just Tom and his wife, Finch the lawyer, a few of their closest neighbors who'd supported them through everything. Not the grand affair most brides dreamed of, but perfect for them. But Roy Anderson had other plans. The attack came 3 nights before the scheduled wedding. Ezra had been in the barn, checking on the horses before bed, when he'd heard Lydia scream. He'd run toward the cabin, his heart in his throat, and arrived to find the door kicked open and Roy inside, holding Lydia by the throat, a knife glinting in his other hand. Roy's face was twisted with rage and alcohol, his clothes filthy, his eyes wild. "Thought you'd won, didn't you?" Roy had snarled when he'd seen Ezra. "Thought that judge could protect you? Nobody takes what's mine." "Roy, let her go." Ezra had kept his voice calm, though inside he was calculating distances, angles, chances. "This is over. The law's on our side. If you hurt her, you'll hang." "Then I'll hang. But she's coming with me. Roy had pressed the knife against Lydia's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. I'll kill her before I let you have her. If I can't have her, nobody can. Lydia had been gasping for air, her eyes wide with terror, but also, Ezra had seen it, with calculation. She'd been waiting for an opening, waiting for the right moment. Think about what you're doing, Ezra had said, edging closer. You kill her, you get nothing but a noose. But if you walk away now, you can leave the territory, start over somewhere else. I don't want to start over. I want what's mine. Roy had shaken Lydia violently. 3 years I've been alone on that worthless piece of land. 3 years of watching everyone else have wives and families while I had nothing. And then I finally get her and you steal her away. Nobody stole anyone. She chose to leave because you beat her. I disciplined her like a husband has a right to do. Roy's voice had risen to a shout. But you turned her against me, filled her head with ideas about rights and choices, and That's when Lydia had moved. With a sudden twist, she ducked under Roy's knife arm and drove her elbow into his solar plexus. The blade had caught her shoulder, cutting deep, but she'd gotten free. Roy had doubled over, wheezing, and Ezra had been on him in an instant. They'd crashed together, falling through the cabin door and onto the porch. Roy had still had the knife, and he'd swung it wildly, catching Ezra across the ribs. Pain had exploded through Ezra's side, but he'd gritted his teeth and held on, trying to pin Roy's knife hand. They'd rolled across the porch, trading blows, each trying to gain the upper hand. Roy had been stronger than he looked, wiry and vicious, fighting with the strength of madness. But Ezra had been fighting for something more important than pride or possession. He'd been fighting for the woman he loved. Roy had gotten on top, the knife raised high, murder in his eyes. You should have minded your own business, Collins. Should have let her freeze in that snow. He'd brought the knife down, aiming for Ezra's throat, but Ezra had caught his wrist, holding the blade inches from his skin, arms trembling with the effort. And then there had been a sharp crack, and Roy's eyes had gone wide. He'd looked down at his chest where a red stain was spreading across his filthy shirt. Then he'd looked up, confusion replacing rage. Lydia had been standing in the doorway, Ezra's rifle at her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face had been white, her hands shaking, but her eyes had been steady. Roy had tried to speak, but only blood had come out. He'd toppled sideways, the knife falling from his hand. For a moment, he'd lain there gasping, his eyes finding Lydia one last time. Then the light had gone out of them, and he'd been still. Silence had fallen over the homestead, broken only by the sound of Lydia's ragged breathing and Ezra's gasping as he clutched his bleeding side. "Is he—" Lydia had whispered. Ezra had checked for a pulse, already knowing what he'd find. "He's dead." The rifle had clattered from Lydia's hands, and she'd collapsed to her knees. Oh God, I killed him! I killed him!" Ezra had pulled himself upright, pressing a hand to his side to staunch the bleeding, and made his way to her. "You saved my life. You saved both our lives. You did what you had to do." "But I killed a man. I took a life." She'd been shaking violently, shock setting in. "I shot him and I didn't even think. I just saw him hurting you and I couldn't let him— Hey, look at me." Ezra had gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're alive. I'm alive." Roy made his choice when he broke into this cabin with a knife. What happened to him is on him, not you. Do you understand? She'd nodded, though he could see she didn't quite believe it yet. The reality of having killed someone, even in self-defense, would take time to process. "We need to get the sheriff," Ezra had said, wincing as pain shot through his side. "And we need to tend these wounds before we bleed out on the porch." The next hours had been a blur of activity. Lydia had helped Ezra inside and bandaged his ribs. The cut was deep but not fatal, missing anything vital. He'd done the same for her shoulder, which was worse, but would heal with time. Then they'd covered Roy's body with a tarp, and Ezra had ridden to Tom Miller's place to send for the sheriff. Thompson had arrived at dawn with his deputies, taking statements, examining the scene, photographing Roy's body. The evidence had been clear: the kicked-in door, the knife still clutched in Roy's hand, the wounds on both Ezra and Lydia consistent with their story of self-defense. "This'll have to go before the judge again," Thompson had said, "but it's clear as day what happened here. Anderson violated the restraining order, broke into your home with a weapon, attempted murder. Miss Hartwell was within her rights to use deadly force to protect herself and you. Will there be charges? Ezra had asked. Doubtful. Morrison's a stickler for the law, but even he knows justified homicide when he sees it. Thompson had glanced at Lydia, who sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket despite the summer heat, staring at nothing. How's she doing? She killed a man. Even when it's justified, that's not easy to live with. No, it's not. Thompson had stood, calling to his deputies to load Roy's body onto the wagon. I'll file my report today. Judge will probably want to see you both tomorrow, but it should be just a formality. And Collins, you did good, standing by her through all this. Not many men would have. After Thompson had left, Ezra had sat beside Lydia on the porch. She'd leaned against him, careful of his injured ribs, and they'd watched the sun climb higher in the sky. I keep seeing his face, she'd said quietly. The moment the bullet hit, the way he looked at me, like he couldn't believe I'd actually done it. I know. Does it get easier, the memory? Eventually. But it never really goes away. You just learn to live with it. He'd wrapped his arm around her shoulders. But Lydia, you need to understand something. You're not a murderer. You're a survivor. There's a difference. Is there? A man is dead because of me. A man is dead because he chose violence over peace, possession over love, pride over life. He had a dozen chances to walk away, after the trial, after the restraining order, even tonight before he kicked in that door. He chose to keep fighting. What happened to him is the consequence of his choices, not yours. She'd been quiet for a long time, then said, I wish I could believe that. Someday you will. Right now, just believe that I love you, and I'm grateful you're alive. She'd turned to look at him, and despite everything, the blood, the pain, the death that had visited their home, she'd smiled slightly. I love you too, and I'm still going to marry you in 3 days, if you'll still have me. Nothing could stop me. The hearing before Judge Morrison had been brief. Thompson's report had been thorough, the evidence overwhelming. Morrison had ruled the killing justified self-defense and closed the case. Roy Anderson was buried in a pauper's grave outside Bitter Creek, mourned by no one. The wedding had gone forward as planned, though both bride and groom wore bandages under their clothes. They'd stood on the porch of the cabin where so much had happened, where they'd argued with Reverend Blackwood, where they'd faced down Roy's threats, where Lydia had saved both their lives. Blackwood had performed the ceremony, his voice solemn but not unkind. Do you, Ezra Collins, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do. And do you, Lydia Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? Lydia had looked at Ezra, this man who'd saved her life in more ways than one, who'd shown her what kindness looked like, who'd taught her that she could be more than property or burden. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. And there, on that porch, surrounded by friends who'd stood by them through everything, Ezra and Lydia had sealed their vows with a kiss. Not the kiss of desperate passion or tragic romance, but something better. The kiss of two people who'd chosen each other freely, who'd fought for that choice, and who would build their future on the foundation of mutual respect and love. The years that followed were good ones. Hard, as all years on the frontier were hard, but good. Lydia's garden flourished, providing food enough to sell in town. Ezra's herd grew. They built additions to the cabin, a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, eventually a small schoolroom. Because Lydia had become the teacher for the surrounding homesteads, children riding in from miles around to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic in the schoolroom Ezra had built for her. She was patient and kind, and the children loved her. Their laughter filled the valley, a sound that Ezra never tired of hearing. Their first child, a son, was born 2 years after the wedding. They named him Thomas, after Tom Miller, and he had his mother's green eyes and his father's quiet strength. A daughter followed 3 years later, Sarah, named for the woman who'd made this place a home before Lydia had arrived. Then another son, then twin girls, until the cabin rang with the sounds of family. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Ezra had taken Lydia to the place where he'd first found her. The fence line where she'd collapsed in the snow, where her life had nearly ended, but instead had begun anew. They'd stood there hand in hand, their children playing in the grass nearby, and looked out over the land they'd built together. "I've been thinking," Ezra had said, "about building something here. A memorial, maybe. To mark the place where everything changed." "What kind of memorial?" "A bench. Nothing fancy, just a simple bench where people can sit and rest. And maybe a marker with words to remind us, to remind everyone of what happened here." What would it say? Ezra had thought for a moment, then smiled. "Where kindness began here." Lydia's eyes had filled with tears. That's perfect. So he'd built it, a sturdy bench made from good oak, placed on the spot where he'd found her half buried in snow. Into the backrest, he'd carved those 4 words that summed up everything they'd been through, everything they'd built. Where kindness began here. Years later, when their children were grown and the homestead had become a prosperous ranch, when Ezra's hair had gone gray and Lydia's face had earned the lines that came from years of laughter and sunshine, they would still sit on that bench together. They'd watch their grandchildren play in the fields, listen to their daughter-in-law singing in the kitchen, see their son working the land that would one day be his. "Do you ever think about that night in the snow?" Lydia had asked once, her hand in Ezra's just as it had been so many times before. "About how close it all came to ending differently?" "Sometimes. But mostly I think about how lucky I am that I decided to check that fence line that morning, that I looked twice at that drift, that I didn't give up on saving you even when it seemed impossible." "I think about the choice you gave me," Lydia had said. "Every day you gave me a choice, to stay or leave, to trust or fear, to live or simply survive. Nobody had ever given me that before. You showed me that I was worth choosing, worth fighting for, worth loving. You showed me I was worth those things too. After Sarah died, I thought my life was over, that I was just marking time until I could join her. But you reminded me that life is precious, that second chances are possible, that love can come in different forms and still be real." They'd sat in silence for a while, comfortable and complete. Their story had been hard. No one would ever call it easy. There had been violence and fear, pain and loss. Lydia still had nightmares sometimes about Roy Anderson, about the night she'd taken a life to save the ones she loved. Ezra still woke occasionally reaching for Sarah, forgetting for a moment that decades had passed since her death. But there had also been joy. So much joy. Children's laughter and harvest celebrations, quiet mornings over coffee and loud evenings around the dinner table, the satisfaction of work well done and crops well tended, the simple pleasure of falling asleep next to someone you loved and waking up to find them still there. "Do you think people will remember?" Lydia had asked, nodding toward the bench. "When we're gone, do you think anyone will know what happened here, what we fought for? I don't know if they'll know the whole story, but they'll see this bench and these words, and maybe they'll understand the important part. That kindness matters, that choosing to help someone, even when it's difficult or dangerous or socially unacceptable, that choice can change everything." "I hope so. I hope someone finds this bench when they're lost and scared, and it reminds them that good people still exist, that help can come from unexpected places, that surviving is possible, even when it doesn't seem like it." Ezra had pulled her closer, and she'd rested her head on his shoulder, and they'd watched the sun set over the land they'd claimed together. The Wyoming sky painted itself in shades of gold and crimson and purple, vast and beautiful and indifferent to human drama, just as it had been the night Lydia had crawled through the blizzard, just as it had been the morning Ezra had found her, just as it would be long after they were gone. But while they were here, in this moment, they were happy. They had been broken separately and had mended together. They had been brought low and had risen higher. They had faced darkness and had chosen light. Their story wasn't the fairy tale Lydia had dreamed of as a girl. There had been no prince on a white horse, no love at first sight, no easy, happily ever after. Instead, there had been hard work and harder choices, pain endured and fears conquered, survival earned through courage and stubbornness and grace. But it was theirs. A story of 2 people who'd refused to die in the storm, who'd refused to let cruelty and violence define their lives, who'd chosen mercy over vengeance, partnership over possession, love over law. And carved into that oak bench on the hill where Ezra had first found Lydia half buried in snow, where her old life had ended and her new one had begun, those 4 words would remain long after they were gone, a testament to what they'd built, a reminder of what mattered, a promise to anyone who found themselves lost and broken that hope still existed, where kindness began here, where 2 wounded souls had found healing, where a mail-order bride beaten and left to die had found a farmer who asked nothing and gave everything, where love, real and hard-won and worth fighting for, had taken root in frozen ground and grown into something that would outlast them both. That was their story. That was their legacy. That was enough.